It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this event. It's the first ever in the series of 11 forums that we've done that takes place in a blended format for obvious reasons, the pandemic requiring us to do things differently. It's a particular pleasure, nevertheless, that many of you have come here and that many others of you are joining us online. We were thinking about whether or not it would be responsible to do an event in a context like this. We decided with the right precautions. It's worth doing it because these are the topics that we're discussing here are also very important topics that we obviously don't want to just postpone. So thank you for joining us on this journey. I will introduce the topic in the next 10 minutes. The topic of this conference being system change, not climate change, towards a renewable normal. So you see the play of words here in terms of, yes, we're moving towards a new normal, but this new normal has to be clean or renewable in order to avoid any coming crisis. My welcome to you is particularly also a warm welcome to all the current participants and former participants of our executive education program in renewable energy management. We've had a module in this very room for this week, also in a blended format with some people joining us online from places like Singapore and the Netherlands. And it's always a pleasure to be here with the current cohort, but also a particular pleasure also to see our returning customers. Many of you are here and others are joining us online. So let me just take you through the journey between when we started planning this event, which was originally supposed to be held in April this year. So we started planning last year and where we are at right now. When we started thinking about this event in late 2019, the climate movement was very strong. And so climate activists were having sort of a great time. And Greta made it on the front page of this magazine of the same name. And we were kind of sure that finally, after years of procrastination, this topic would have kind of received the attention it deserves. And things were starting to move. The same was true on a political level. Next slide, please. Where the new European Commission seemed determined to actually give this an important push. We heard yesterday from Sandrine Dixon that there is this kind of discussion in Brussels around kind of the Green Deal that would combine recovery measures with kind of public investment in renewables, energy efficiency. And even before the outbreak of the pandemic, this seemed to be a high priority. We saw pictures like this. Hint, one of the three is not a member of the European Commission, but there was kind of this identification with kind of the movement on the social movement that pushed for climate change with the new Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen and Franz Timmermans, who was tasked to make that Green Deal happen. What happened then was, of course, the pandemic hit, and that meant that governments, well, first of all, went online like we did, but also went into crisis, into firefighting mode, because all of a sudden there was kind of more urgent things to address, and this has kind of taken a hold of the agenda for quite a long time. On our end, as I also went online, we planned the 3rd of April originally. We were there kind of having the results of our consumer barometer in renewable energy, which were ready and there to present it. We couldn't present them on site, so we learned very quickly how to organize a webinar. And my colleague Merla Kubli, who's here with us, also facilitated by Arthur Honecker, who's also here with us today, kind of broadcasted from our living rooms the results of this, which was a very interesting event. We'll hear more about this later in the second panel. Another thing that happened, we then kind of had learned to do webinars. So we did webinars in a row, so to say. Another webinar happened here with the Executive School of the University of St. Gallen, where we discussed similarities and differences between the health crisis and the climate crisis. It seemed that people had realized that flattening the curve was very important. So that particular curve here, which was the curve of infections, and we learned that because of the exponential growth of the infections, early action mattered a lot. So wasn't just important to do something against it, it was also very important when we would do something against the public health crisis. Now, if you look at the curves that are forecasted for the temperature, the global temperature change in terms of climate change, not only do they have the same colors in the IPCC report, but they also have this sort of exponential trend. And also the IPCC has long argued that it's not just important that we do something, but it's also very important when we do something against climate change. Because if we don't take action soon enough, we might be overwhelmed, similarly to the health sector being overwhelmed by the climate crisis. So here we are kind of discussing these issues. And then at the same time, other similarities seem to occur. If you could click one more time, please. Thank you. Other similarities, sorry. What was kind of good news in all of this was that it doesn't seem to be only something that was kind of discussed in expert circles like the IPCC. It was also something that many people out there seem to share. So there was a survey in April at the peak of the corona crisis that surveyed people around the world and found that overall 71% of them actually agreed that the climate crisis is as important as the corona crisis. So it seemed like there was really this momentum to say we should do something against it. One other thing that happened though is, well, 71% said it's really important to do something about climate. What about the other 29% or parts of them? Well, as we've seen more recently, there's a minority, but a very vocal minority of people who feel uncomfortable with the measures that governments have taken against corona and measures to protect public health. This seemed over the recent months to take more and more I'd say radical forms. I've been in Berlin as the co-advisor of a PhD student there on the 28th of August, and the city was getting ready for the next day where there was this massive demonstration that had an interesting mix of participants, ranging from people who were kind of skeptical about the science that was underlying government's action against climate change, against corona, excuse me, but then also included populists, people from very different angles of the political spectrum. Now, observing this seems to also show some similarities to some of the discussions we've seen on climate change. We've seen a small but very vocal group of people doubting the science of climate change, despite more than 90% of the scientists agreeing on what the facts are. And we see people who are unhappy with or uncomfortable with what government, the kind of government action that's being taken to address the issues, such as, for example, deploying low carbon technologies. So this is an interesting space to watch. It is, as I said, an interesting mix of kind of people and ideologies meeting there. And it is fertile ground for populists. Talking about populists, well, some of the governments seemed to respond to the health crisis in a way that, well, in hindsight, seems to have addressed the issue, but made some people uncomfortable. Some others seem to see a political advantage in, I'd say, setting the world on fire, quite literally to some extent. So that is a reality that, well, we will see for how long we will have to deal with this. November is going to be an interesting indication. But that is one way that governments respond to the climate crisis. Another way is what, for example, South Korea has been doing. South Korea has, in fact, come up with a Green Deal, not unlike the one that the European Union is pursuing, with all the kinds of things in there that many people in this room and in this event would see as very reasonable responses to the urgency of the climate crisis. So they have a target of getting 1 million electric vehicles on the road by 2025. They want to install another 42 gigawatts of solar and wind. They also, the government wants to lead by example, put 225 solar roofs on public buildings. And they want to create, with all of this, more than 500,000 green jobs. So very different responses by governments. What's also interesting to observe then, of course, is consumer behavior that changed a lot in recent months. One thing that definitely changed was demand for high carbon transport collapsed. So airline executives had a really hard time because demand for flights was down by 90% more overnight almost. We had interesting headlines. One of my favorite headlines in recent weeks was airlines hunt for parking spaces as virus grounds flights. So shout out to the journalist who came up with that headline. Of course, as a former car driver, or former car owner, I can very much empathize with that. Hunting for parking space is a really hard thing to do. But maybe I shouldn't joke about this. It definitely seems to be a very strong structural change for this particular industry. Which, if you just look at it from a climate perspective, I mean, this has been one of the main headaches in recent years, the sheer amount of growth that occurred in high carbon transportation, in particular aviation. So this seems to have seen a very strong trend break. However, at the same time, we saw collateral damages on other means of transport, low carbon means of transport. As someone who has taken that same train that Greta took when she traveled to the Madrid climate summit, it was a pity to see that climate-friendly train has also been suspended as a consequence of the corona crisis. So yes, we have less flights, but we also have less carbon-friendly alternatives in some parts of the world. Other governments, like the Austrian government, for example, when they crafted a rescue package for their airline, they also combined it with investment in night trains. So again, we have this polarization between different government responses. One thing that's encouraging is the shift to electric mobility in recent months. This is last year's REMforum speaker, Christina Bü, who already last year told us about the very encouraging numbers in Norway, and that trend has further accelerated. So in June, in the month of June, 2/3 of all the new cars in Norway were electric, most of them battery electric, some plug-in hybrid electric. That's up from the about 50% that it was last year. So this seems to be a really strong trend. If you listen to the Financial Times with a bit more of kind of UK understatement, that's what the headline sounds like. A brighter outlook for European EV sales amid the COVID-19 wreckage. So yes, the car industry had also been hard hit, but also on a European level, the share of of electric vehicles is increasing by about 2/3 compared to last year right now. And one thing that's particularly interesting for some of the incumbent car manufacturers is that Volkswagen, for example, who's coming up with this ID.3, says that 85% of their 37,000 people who have made a pre-booking of that new car, that's not really on the streets yet, are new customers. And on average, they're about 10 years younger and more kind of environmentally minded than the current Volkswagen customer. So that's great, sort of good for the environment, but good for Volkswagen as well, because they obviously are looking for ways to rejuvenate their customer base. Last but not least, and that's my final remark here, it's interesting to observe how investor sentiment is changing. So governments are changing, consumer behavior is changing, but also investor sentiment has been changing. This is a study by Charles Donovan and his colleagues, who's going to join us later for one of the panels at Imperial College, together with the International Energy Agency. They looked at share prices of renewable and non-renewable companies in the United States. The curve up here, the curve up here that's really outperforming the market right now since the beginning of the year is renewable energy stocks. And the curve down here is the one about fossil fuel companies. In the United States, where the government is not necessarily having those priorities, so you could say something seems to have happened in financial markets where more investors are now kind of getting this message that, in fact, maybe we are at the beginning of a transition towards cleaner energy. So the interesting question then, of course, is where do we go from here? So there's a lot of kind of volatility in the world right now. And the question is, well, which way do we go? Will we go deeper into climate crisis, or will we finally kind of grasp this opportunity to take a green recovery to kind of move towards a resilient economy, as our dinner speaker yesterday said? That's a question that's difficult to answer for any one individual, but that's one of the reasons why it's great to have an event like this, where we kind of get together, exchange views, and reflect on these very important questions for our future. I'm glad to have you all here for this. I'm also glad that we have a very competent moderator who will facilitate a discussion with experienced people from different backgrounds, and I hope you will enjoy this insightful day with us, both here in the room and online. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand over to Arthur Honecker.
Thank you. It's almost ironic, isn't it? For years now, we've been talking about how the human behavior can change in the face of a crisis, only to experience it right now, albeit not in the way many of us expected. The COVID-19 pandemic has had and continues to have, as you mentioned, a profound effect on our daily lives, on the economy, and on policy decisions as well. As I don't have to tell you, the pandemic pales in comparison to the enormous consequences of climate change. So how are we as humanity are going to change our behavior in that regard, both as individuals as well as on a systemic level? And what energy solutions, be it big and small, can we come up with that are both quick and sustainable? In other words, how can we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees without having a magic bullet in our pocket? Well, these are the questions that lie at the heart of the research of our first speaker, and he's known for it around the world. So I'm anxious to hear what answers he's found. He's joining us from the Tyndall Center for Climate Change at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. Please welcome Charlie Wilson.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. So yes, my name's Charlie Wilson. I'm from the Tyndall Center in the UK, and I'm very sorry not to be able to be there with you. But I wanted to talk about limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. But before I do that, let me just show you where I am. The Tyndall Center is actually based in the east of England in Norfolk, but I'm right down in the southwest tip of England in Cornwall, home of the cream tea, but more importantly for this conference, the county in the UK with the highest level of solar PV penetration of any of the counties in the UK. So I thought an appropriate beginning for your session today. Now, although it's got a lot of solar PV, it doesn't have the best broadband bandwidth. So I'm going to actually turn off my video for the rest of the talk and then turn it back on at the end just to preserve a bit of bandwidth. Okay, so the mainstream view among researchers working on global climate change mitigation is that magic bullets are necessary to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So what do I mean by this? Well, in 2015, the countries of the world came together in Paris and committed to a target of limiting warming to 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. I'm sure you're all familiar with this goal. They also set a greater ambition of trying to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And the reason why is that the risks which you avoid if you limit warming to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 are significant. So this map shows on the left in purple the hotspots around the world exposed to what are called multi-sectoral risks from climate change. So this could be risks affecting agriculture, flooding, extreme weather, and multiple sectors. And these purple blobs are showing risks which we would avoid if we limited warming to 1.5 degrees compared to the 2 degrees C target. The map on the right then superimposes areas of the world in grey where we have vulnerable populations with low capacity to adapt to those risks. And you can see that large swathes of the developing world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, India, parts of China, and also parts of the Middle East and Latin America, have this kind of double hit of additional risks from 2 degrees C of warming relative to 1.5 degrees with low capacity to adapt. And, you know, I could have picked different indicators which would have been more relevant to our lives more directly relevant to our lives in Switzerland, or the UK. So the same story. So in some sense, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is a simple proposition. We know very clearly what we have to do. We can reduce energy demand. This essentially downsizes the problem. We can decarbonize the energy supply, or we can engineer the atmosphere. And these three graphs, taken from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that they did a couple of years ago on warming of 1.5 degrees, these three graphs show you the mainstream view. That is, the grey block, the emissions from fossil fuels, need to come down. The brown, which is land use change, tends to shift from being a net source of emissions to being a net sink of emissions. But it's the yellow blob which represents this magic bullet, these negative emission technologies, particularly one called BECCS, or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So what is BECCS? Well, this is a very simple little infographic which shows you on the left the combustion of fossil fuels for generating energy releases CO2 into the atmosphere. In the middle, you can either capture the CO2 from that combustion processes, or you can burn bioenergy in your power stations. And these are broadly these are broadly net zero energy systems. Or on the right, you can grow bioenergy, burn it in combustion facilities to generate energy or electricity, capture the CO2, and this creates a net transfer of CO2 from the atmosphere to long-term geological storage. So this is this negative emission technology, or BECCS. Now, as I showed before, many of the 1.5 degrees C scenarios show a large-scale reliance on these negative emission technologies in order to reach the 1.5 degrees C goal. And this is a really bad idea for lots of reasons. It's highly risky, it's extremely costly, it imposes additional stresses on land use, which impact food security. But for me, most of all, as someone who works on innovation and diffusion, it's enormously problematic relying on a technology which essentially does not exist at any meaningful commercial scale, and essentially putting this at the heart of our efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So the photo on the bottom right shows some bioenergy storage domes at Drax, which is used to be one of Europe's largest coal-fired power plants. And Drax has started a pilot test of burning bioenergy in one of its boilers and capturing the CO2. But this is a very, very small scale pilot operation, and there's only a handful of these worldwide. Yet in these 1.5 degrees C scenarios, you see this playing a major role in the energy system within the next few decades. So in response to this, with colleagues, particularly in Vienna, we created a different vision. We created a vision of a global future with more energy services, less energy demand, relying on rapid renewables deployment and electrification. And this was an alternative way of reaching the 1.5 degrees C goal. Now, what do I mean by energy services? So these are the things we ultimately care about from the energy system. So we care about thermal comfort, mobility, nutrition, entertainment and communication from all the digital technologies we carry, and so on. So in our vision, we focused on how we could increase these energy services while requiring less energy inputs. So how did we do this? Well, first off, any scenario is essentially a story about the future. And so we created a storyline of change between now and 2050. And we called this the LED, or low energy demand story or scenario. Now, this wheel on the right shows you the elements of this story. So around the edge, we have the 5 big picture drivers of change in this future. Rising demands for quality of life, rapid urbanization, a diversification of end user roles away from being passive consumers of goods and services to playing more active roles, continued rapid innovation in information and communication technologies, and consequently, the emergence of new forms of energy service. Now, in the inner wheel in brown, on, you see 5 more proxy deployment of things like renewables, decentralization, an emphasis on granularity or small-scale distributed solutions, the rise of usership, so shifting from owning goods to accessing services, and digitalization in our daily lives. And I'll come back to some of these later in the talk. So based on this storyline, we looked at all the available evidence we could find for what was going on the ground in terms of innovation. We looked at technological innovations, so things like more fuel-efficient vehicles or electric vehicles, more efficient home technologies, and so on. But we also looked at business model innovations, for example, how car sharing or taxi sharing firms were delivering shared mobility solutions in cities. We looked at behavioral innovations, so the rise of the smartphone and the way that this is integral to our everyday lives now. And also social and institutional innovations. So, for example, how communities in cities might come together to work out ways of living car-free or with low car dependence. We took evidence from these various innovations and the literature we could find, and then we built some simple quantitative models of the amounts of energy services that these innovations could provide with much lower levels of energy requirements. So we looked at thermal comfort, we looked at consumer goods, we looked at mobility and food. And we also looked at the upstream or supply chain sectors required to deliver those services. And we quantified that a future in 2050 could have an energy demand which was about 40% lower than where we are today, while delivering more energy services. And this is critically important, particularly in the global south, that you can deliver more services, more well-being for less energy input. Now you can see in this ruler, the green horizontal line is the low energy demand scenario, and it's well below the red line, which was roughly where we were when we started the study. And all the other horizontal lines towards the top of the ruler show you that the mainstream view of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees sees energy demand continuing to rise. And essentially because the size of the energy system is getting bigger, the size of the decarbonisation challenge is getting bigger, and therefore you have to rely more on this magic bullet of BECCS. So we took those numbers for energy demand and we ran them through some complex systems modeling to quantify the effect on the global energy system and land use system, and consequently the effect on climate change. And we showed that our scenario limited warming to 1.5 degrees with no reliance on the magic bullet, and additionally strong benefits for other UN Sustainable Development Goals. So here's the graph I showed you before. It's now got one additional scenario on the left, and that is our scenario. And you can see that it doesn't have any of this yellow blob underneath the x-axis, these negative emissions. So, okay, you may think, well, this is all very well. This is a nice storyline about the future, but where's the evidence that this is feasible? Well, I mean, the most evidence that Rolf also mentioned in his introduction is the continued rapid deployment of renewables and the continued electrification of many of our end-use demands. But I want to just share with you briefly evidence for 2 additional types of evidence, one on what we call granularity and one on digitalization. So if you think about this idea of granularity, you see these pictures show on the left different energy supply technologies from solar PV all the way up to nuclear power. And on the right, you see various energy end-use technologies, in this case for mobility, from the e-bike all the way up to the massive Airbuses. Now, the technologies at the top, we characterize as being granular. So they're relatively small in unit size, low in unit cost, and modular. And the technologies at the bottom, we characterize as being more lumpy. So these are the opposite, large in unit size, high unit cost, and indivisible. So we took some historical analysis of a very wide range of energy technologies, and we found the following results. So these 2 graphs both show on the x-axis a measure of granularity. So essentially, each data point represents a technology, and the data points towards the left of each graph are the more granular options, and the data points on the right of each graph are the more lumpy technologies. So look at the graph on the left to start with, and you see that the more granular technologies on the left have shorter diffusion timescales. That is, they get to market quicker, they deploy more rapidly than the lumpy technologies. If you look at the graph on the right, you see that the more granular technologies have higher learning rates. And a learning rate essentially is a measure of the speed with which a technology improves in performance and reduces in cost. So you see from these two pieces of analysis that more granular technologies tend to deploy faster and learn or improve quicker. And both of these are critical for rapid movement on emission reduction. We also looked at a variety of indicators of legitimacy. So these are three graphs have the same format. The granular technologies are more to the left and the lumpy technologies are more to the right. So look at the graph on the left to start with, and you see that the more granular technologies have lower Gini coefficients, and Gini coefficients are measures of inequality. So we show that more granular technologies are more equally distributed and accessible. In the middle graph, we show that more granular technologies generate more jobs, critically important in this current economic environment. And on the right-hand graph, you see that more granular technologies have higher benefit cost ratios in terms of public R&D investments. And again, as Rolf mentioned with the green stimulus packages being prepared, this is critically important as well in today's context. So granularity has significant benefits for rapid emission reduction. Now, finally, just a word on digitalization. I mean, this will be very familiar to all of us in our daily lives. And one of the interesting things we looked at in our scenario was this possibility of accelerating a shift from owning stuff to using or accessing services. We've seen this incredibly rapidly with respect to the way we consume media. And will we start seeing this in the ways we consume mobility, our own consumer goods, and also energy in our homes? Well, we did lots of analysis on this, but I just want to share with you one thought experiment, that if you take the technology on the left, the smartphone, which we probably all have in our pockets right now, and you assume that that fully displaces all of these single-use appliances shown on the right. In other words, we move from a world in which we own lots of goods to a world in which we access services through digital technologies. The savings in energy use, in standby energy use, in embodied energy, so the energy required to make all those products, as well as the dematerialization benefits shown in these colored circles, are significant. And importantly, these digital technologies, unlike BECCS, can deploy very rapidly. Again, a critical ingredient of a 1.5 degree scenario. So with that, I will end, and I'll just leave you again with this vision which we depicted in our scenario. And I very much hope that these remarks can be some useful food for thought for your conference today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for these insights. They'll definitely be part of the discussion at the forum here today, and I'm sure they'll come up in the conversation we're about to have up here in front. You see, one of the key controversies when talking about climate change has always been the question whether business is a part of the solution or rather part of the problem. And given the undeniable developments in recent decades, though, it's clear that the business sector will have to adapt to what we coined a renewable normal here. And it will have to do so facing a post-pandemic environment, which brings with it its own challenges. That's what we'll talk about right now. And I'd like to welcome my guests at this point. First is Merla Kubli. She's with Climate Strike Switzerland, working among other things on the climate action plan for Switzerland. Hi. And also Andre Reichel. Where's Andre? Good morning. He's professor at the, oh yes, he's professor for international management and sustainability at the International School of Management, ISM, in Germany. And then joining us via video conferences are Jochen Wermuth. He's founder of Wermuth Asset Management, investing in companies and initiatives with a positive impact on climate change. Jochen, can you hear us? Yes, we can see you. Thumbs up. I like that. And Cornelia Daniels, she's a solar pioneer in Austria. Among other things, she's working to cover 1,001 roofs with PV panels by the end of the year. Welcome.
Good morning.
So, by the way, to our participants on Zoom, you can send your questions to my panelists here via the chat function. I'm sure there will be a lot to discuss by the end of this panel here. So I'd like to start off with the topic of the day and topic of the year, probably COVID-19. And the big debate here as it relates to climate change is whether the pandemic will have a positive effect, showing, for example, the ability to act broadly in an unprecedented way, or whether it will turn out to be a great eraser of progress made in awareness and political priorities in recent years. So I'd love to first get your take on that. What you think? Will it be a plus or a minus for the climate movement?
So I think we have seen three main reactions from politicians. There has been politicians instrumentalizing this pandemic to actually actively take out the climate of the agenda. There have been politicians just kind of forgetting about the climate, and there have been politicians instrumentalizing the situation to talk about climate a little bit more. But I think that in general, the attention kind of diminished, but from the attention of politicians to the climate diminished, but the population has become a little bit more aware of what a crisis means. And I think they can relate better, have a little bit more empathy for other crises as well, such as the climate crisis.
Well, that's the political reaction. And what about investors? I'd like to get the take of Jochen Wermuth here. How has climate-friendly investment changed throughout these recent months?
Well, I wish I was as optimistic as Wüstenhagen at the beginning. I think we continue to be very happy as impact investors, climate impact investors, that the returns that you get from investing in climate solutions are outstanding. But the reasons the returns are outstanding is that there's still a huge shortage of capital. If you take the German sovereign wealth fund, KENFO, where I'm an investment committee, when the global markets collapsed some 30%, the fund only lost 4% because it was largely out of fossil fuels, coal, oil, shale gas. The markets rebounded, it did very well as well. Hydropower stations run of the river in Europe maybe yield 8, 9, 10% return. Why do they do that? With 1/100th the CO2 footprint of average in the EU, 1,000th the CO2 footprint of coal. They have such high returns because nobody's putting money into this. So the billions and trillions being poured into global markets still don't arrive in the projects where we need them. We have a climate finance gap, which the IEA, IRENA, estimate to be 1 trillion euros a year, which sounds large. It's 1% of global GDP. That makes it small. Discussed this with Pope Francis, and he said, for an average German, 1% or so is 500 euros of investment a year. That's sort of the price of an expensive handbag or a pair of sneakers. And it's ridiculous we don't get it done. So there still is a huge shortage, and I find it extremely frustrating that investors, business people, households, activists, entrepreneurs, everybody's calling for clear guidelines, which is needed through a CO2 price. Once we have that, I think we could have a huge flow of capital in the right direction. We very much support in Germany the move of the 27 Nobel Prize winners, 15 chiefs of the Bureau of Economic Advisors in the US, for a CO2 tax that reflects the externalities, redistributed per capita to the citizens, so they can do exactly the granular type of things that we've seen in the previous speech by Charlie. In Germany, at 10 tons per person of emissions and a 640 euros per ton estimated cost of a ton of CO2 over 100 years, according to the Federal Agency for the Environment, every German citizen would start the year with a 6,400 euro cash payment to them. If they behave on average as the average German, they would spend the money over the year. If they cycle more, if they fly less often to Malle, they have cash in the pocket at the end of the year. And this would be very just. People who are poor, consuming less, would be left with more money. Those who wish to fly 3 private jets can do so, but they have to pay more money. This is, I think, a key to success to move the capital.
It's an interesting idea, although your outlook wasn't too positive there in the beginning. Maybe Cornelia Daniel has some more positive views on this when it comes to the change in a willingness to act, and for example, in her case, to go solar. Cornelia?
Mm-hmm. Good morning from Vienna. Here in Austria, we see a very, very big move towards solar energy. That's also due to the fact that we're a few years behind Germany. I mean, we just started a bit later, and now there's a real push. And Corona gave, I guess, the government the opportunity to really do some radical programs, and solar energy is one of the technologies that is profiting from the post-Corona investment funds. So I've been working in the solar business for 10 years now, and I remember back in the years, people would say, oh great, solar energy, that's totally the future. And I'm always like, well, what about it's the present? And I have the feeling that we're slowly getting into a form of present time for solar energy and renewables in Austria. And like I have constant meetings with customers, and they all want to go solar now because we have a very good program at the moment for a few months. We will see what happens after February when the Corona fund is over. But then we're going to have a new legislation that really helps push solar energy. But I'm very much with Mr. Wermuth. All the subsidies, they're just a way to prevent a real CO2 price. We would not need any of the subsidies if we had a real CO2 price, and that all the external factors that are carried by the society at the moment are not within the goods. And I'm always very much pushing also for governments to make maybe CO2 price just for governmental issues. It's not as you have to pay the CO2 price, but you're accounting it into everything that you're doing. And so government should go first with a real CO2 price. I think that would help the population to adapt to the idea that this is not something that will kill us. I think people have no idea that it's not that much if we do it, but it just would change a lot. And I think that's something that that is very, very important to also push in post-Corona times, that we just need a real market price, and it's not enough just to push money into the market. That's something that's a short time, that's something that helps us in the short time, but in the long run, we will need this still.
So short, the pandemic has the potential to shift attitudes, but it might not be enough, and CO2 pricing is actually the thing that should be on the table. Do you agree with that, André Reichen?
I mean, what we saw in the pandemic, and that was quite interesting, is that we're obviously all able to radically shift our behaviors in a very short amount of time, even if need is there, if we have to do it. And I just want to give one example from the German case, and this was probably similar in Austria and Switzerland and also in the UK. The shift to working from home In Germany, we were about 10 to 15% of the German workforce was working from home before the Corona crisis. And the predominant idea was that it wasn't possible to really ramp it up, maybe. During the pandemic, we had 41% of the German workforce working from home, which led to dramatic decreases in traffic and congestions. We also started to realize that we actually can do it. The technology is there. The techniques, the cultural techniques to organize meetings like this have been developed very rapidly or so. And this in a totally unplanned and chaotic manner. And this is something maybe, and I'm speaking as a German here, it was an interesting experience that even we can improvise. Not in schools,
even the Swiss.
Even the Swiss, yes, I know, you're even more horrible than we are with this. The only system that failed large scale in Germany were the schools. All other systems actually adapted quite rapidly. Now, however, and this is the thing that I was talking with a friend of mine who also had to homeschool her kids. I'll say, you know, we somehow managed it by disaster. Just imagine if we would have the time to make it by design, to really design our work systems, to design how we educate and school people, how we organize transportation, our urban infrastructures, how this could really change our lifestyles and the way we go about in, for example, energy consumption. So I think there is kind of a window of opportunity and kind of an experience that we all had that we can make this happen. Of course, we cannot now just go back to the old normal. There has to be also institutional change. And this also goes maybe back to what Charlie was saying with cutting demand. It will not just happen by throwing renewable energy at people. This is not going to change a lot. If we just ramp up a renewable energy system and everything else stays the same, there will not be any solution to probably the problem of climate change. So we need institutional changes in the way we work, in the way we commute, in the way we consume. So politics has to play a role and has to set some new frameworks for it. But as we saw, and I'm just going back to the work from home example, in Germany, more than 2/3 of people who work from home would love to continue to do so. They said, actually, there's an interesting study. 30% were saying there is no single downside to working from home. 30%. And I found this very interesting. Even with the problem of homeschooling, people actually love it. And the most thing they love is that they don't have to commute anymore. Mm-hmm. So there is a potential there and a willingness for change. And I think politics have to pick up the ball now.
Well, underlying this willingness was the sense of urgency, the threat of a virus. And now, if I look at the discussion in regard to climate change, that has shifted because climate policy was the number one issue in many elections in 2019, including the one in Switzerland. And now it's the pandemic, and with it, the economy and healthcare, public health, and so on. So how do you keep up a sense of urgency within the public in these circumstances, Ismail?
So since the movement has started in Switzerland and all over the world, our force has been going to the streets and showing that we were many people and that we wanted this change. And obviously with the pandemic, we couldn't do that anymore and we had to adapt, reinvent ourselves. We obviously lost a little bit of force and we had to get creative and find new solutions. We tried out digital strikes, which are obviously not the same as going to the streets in front of a government. We tried to shift a little bit more on the educational side. So we are quite active on social medias. We're trying to keep pushing the message, especially to young people, which are our main audience. But we're also trying to really work on ourselves inside of the movement to educate ourselves so that when the time, and now I think it's coming, that we're starting to go back to the streets, we're really very informed and we can inform the others about the urgency of the crisis. Because I feel like everyone knows about climate change, but most people don't really feel how urgent it actually is to take action.
And as you said, I mean, you're starting to go back on the street. Last Friday was the first national strike since March, if I'm correct. Do you also consider other tactics of protest?
So there will be a week of civil disobedience in Bern from the 20th to the 25th of September. So we are already kind of shifting from student strikes to something a little bit more aggressive, I would say.
How is that going to look?
Sorry?
How is that going to look? What do I have to imagine of the civil disobedience? That's a broad term.
Yeah, no, there won't be any violence.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that.
That's a start. I think I don't have the detailed program in mind right now, but it will be something we are working on in collaboration with Extinction Rebellion and other movements. And so I would imagine there will be some XR style actions and some more climate strike style actions as well.
Okay, we'll see. I'm curious now. Okay, and the question is also, when awareness shifts, is that enough, or does it translate into concrete action in people's daily lives? Maybe Cornelia Daniel can give us some insights from Austria, where obviously the climate movement is also very strong in recent years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm very thankful for the climate movement here in Austria. I can really see how Fridays for Future has really put the pressure very much on political decisions, and they're really looking into that there is something changing, and that's a big help for the whole industry. What was the question again?
I'm sorry?
What was the question again? The concrete question?
Whether it translates into concrete action, for example, in your field, when it comes to solar panels, do you see that the underlying force is an awareness of the problem, or rather that people are making cost-based decisions?
What was interesting during Corona is that people were much more concerned about blackout issues. So I got a lot of calls like, I want to be prepared for something that's happening like Corona, and it's a big blackout, and I want to have a storage system that works. And my customers are usually business consumers, so I had to change a little bit also to help private customers to get their to give out the knowledge for that. So there's a big awareness shift in the in households, and that's translating into more systems, more storage systems, more smart systems, more blackout systems, but the technology is not ready yet. Like there are some products, but it's not a very big business where it's like, yeah, that's easy, and you need the grid, you need all the regulations, and so there is a gap between what the customers want and what the market can deliver. And business-wise, there is a change in a way that, well, we wanted to do this for so many years, and now we're really doing it. I have like a pipeline of 500 customers that are finally really getting into a move. The problem with solar energy is that it's not something that you need, that like you have a pain where you have to invest, and then you get this and the pain is over. That's just not the case for solar energy. The electricity comes out of there, no matter if you have it on your roof or if the power plant is somewhere around Vienna. So the big point now for governments and politicians is to create a sense of urgency in that you really have to do it now. And the Austrian government managed this to really give this reason, like to do it now, and not in 5 years, not in 10 years, but now. So this is really translating.
But solar is a very well-established technology, and demand is high. I'm glad to hear that. But there's also, and I'm interested to get Jochen Wermuth's perspective on this. There's also fairly recent innovations where oftentimes there isn't a lot of financial reserves in companies to pull through a recession like the one we're about to experience. So how can tomorrow's game changers survive the turbulences of today?
Yeah, so I just wanted to quickly help our climate activists a little bit. On the 25th of September, we have a global climate strike. And I have the pleasure of greeting you from Luisa Neubauer and Greta Thunberg to remind you all that you should not only go let your children go, but that we should go with our students, our professors, and our companies. So in Germany, there's a big push to get companies to join this effort. And in fact, one of the more conservative groups, the Axel Springer group, has Friedel Springer, so to many people, an enemy of the climate movement, actually participating in Fridays for Future marches and sending all that stuff. So the 25th of September is a big event.
Interesting. Yeah.
Show Corona-compliant demonstrations, because we feel it's quite frustrating to have fascists and others in a non-Corona compliant fashion take the streets. So much on the activist side. And there's an organization called German Zero here, which has been set up to be the professionals helping the Fridays for Futures movement. Developed a plan how Germany could reach zero emissions by 2035, because we calculated that if you want to achieve 1.5 degrees and you want to be honest about using the remaining budget, and you divide it for the first time in history, not by how much we are consuming now, but per capita, then Germany should actually be net zero by 2023. So the whole 2050 talk is nice, but it's way too late. Greenland ice cap has passed the tipping point. We have 7 meter higher sea levels guaranteed. So it's urgent. But to your question, I'm sorry. The question, so for example, there's 2 fantastic companies we're looking at the moment. One is deep geothermal drilling anywhere. If successful, and they're close, they can drill not 3 to 5 kilometers deep as is standard in the oil and gas industry, but 10 kilometers deep with a plasma drill. That would mean you could hit geothermal not just on 3% of the world's surface, which is worse than playing roulette, but on 70% of the world's surface. All of Europe could be a source of geothermal. Any coal power plant could do 3 wells for about 20 million euros and never have to buy coal again, use the steam and produce power and heat locally. We hope to do a first project in the Lausitz region. Very difficult to do fundraising and keep the company alive because people can't visit. So it's very crucial. If you know any investors that are courageous enough to invest on the basis of video due diligence, that would be fantastic. We're not invested yet. We're trying to lead a group of investors to do that. Another company called NextWave, an amazing company that in essence would double the power per solar system. So instead of paying 4 cents per kilowatt hour in Germany, and 2 cents in record in south of Europe, in Portugal, we could get to 2 cents in Germany and 1 cent in Portugal within 10 years. We could get to 10% more efficiency now. Again, a company that's groundbreaking. It could change the world. It would restart the European solar industry. The European Commission is being asked to start a European Solar Alliance to restart, because this solar power also has 70% less CO2 footprint, not counting shipment from China, and you would have you'd have much more competition. At the moment, 95% of energy that we will be consuming in the future comes from China. So we're just swapping from importing oil and gas from Russia and Saudi Arabia to importing panels to China. Here's a chance for Europe to have their own production at half the cost of the Chinese. Very impressive, but to try to get money in this time and day and age is extremely difficult. People are very scared. And in terms of the 3 proposals that we're putting forward, one is the CO2 tax, dividend and border tax. The second is we need a group of climate endowments, we call it, that pension funds, insurance companies in Europe pool their assets to actually put them into renewables, because at the moment they don't have the staff to do it. And the third is what's called a Global Climate Venture Fund series, been developed by the World Economic Forum. Basically, the government should stop throwing money at the way they do it at climate solutions. They should give money to a fund. What has happened is that in Paris, Obama got together a mission innovation group that committed to double the innovation spending for climate solutions from $15 billion to $30 billion a year. But I can tell you, I don't know of any in 20 years experience company that's ever seen any of this money. Most of this money seems to go to General Electric or to Siemens or someone else. So the idea is, instead of doing this, governments should put money into a global fund of funds, which would invest in new venture funds in climate solution space, but would also invest directly in climate solutions. And we hope to set such a thing up. And for this, we need government support.
glad we got that down. So that's the investment side. But also I want to quickly, before we open up for questions, touch on the flip side of this, which is the divestments, effectively taking funds from the dirtiest of industries and transferring them into more sustainable sectors. Now, I imagine that could be problematic as well on the Reichel at the moment, where people are looking for simply stability and could stick to a more traditional approach. You know?
I mean, that is always what we kind of aiming for also with the Green Deal of the European Union. I mean, there is a lot of forward-looking policies in there, but of course, in a time of crisis, there is obviously a tendency also to preserve what was there. However, what the corona pandemic was doing, it exposed, of course, all those industries that had some big issues before, for example, the automotive industry in Europe and especially in Germany. And it has accelerated certain trends. Of course, this would mean that some of these companies might not survive this decade or so. And it also exposed high carbon transportation industries like the airline industry, which will take a long time to recover. But if it's not going to recover, all the better. You know, airline industries are producing GHG emissions, nothing else, and it's a very inefficient way to move people around in a way. So what we see here is a accelerated structural change in the economy, and that's not new. We always had structural changes. We always have new companies, new businesses emerging. We also see the rise of tech industries, which are now the dominant industries on the planet, which is hard, of course, from a German perspective and maybe from a European perspective, because we don't have a lot of tech industries. But this is sort of a natural thing. So instead of trying to preserve industries, the more smart approach here would, of course, be to see how can we probably accelerate some of these changes and make our economies fit for these changes. And also speaking from a German perspective, when I was young, a little kid in the late 70s, early 80s, there always was talk, coal industry is done, you know, we have to get out of coal. 40 years later, we finally start to get out of coal. But it took us almost half a century to really let that sink in, that we have to abandon coal or so. And people who were getting into coal 40 years ago had a lifetime of employment or so, and now a secure pension. So sometimes we preserve these structures for too long, and preserving structures for too long, now let me be a bit neoliberal for a second. If you preserve industry structures for too long, they get inefficient, they suck up too much money, too much employment, and they block innovation. So we should make an argument that if you preserve industries, you are actually hindering innovation, and you're keeping people in the wrong jobs for too long. And this will be costly then down the road. So I think this is kind of the chance now to really argue for a strong structural change within the European economies.
So the system change that we are talking about today, in effect, also for the better of the economy. Thank you. There's many thoughts to build on, and I want to give our audience now the opportunity to get involved, both in person here at Holzweit and through our online comment forum. Pascal Wichard has gathered the inputs there on the online forum. Pascal, what do we have?
Yes, thank you very much. Not that many questions from the online audience, just one comment maybe to add to your discussion. There was a talk around energy is important, but then also the cause of this pandemic is also kind of a biodiversity loss. And we haven't talked about this on the panel yet. Maybe we can weigh in a bit on that. Otherwise, if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to type them into the chat, and I can bring them afterwards, right? But maybe the biodiversity topic.
Yes, biodiversity. Thank you. I don't think we have a lot of time, so one question will do. That's fine. But biodiversity, obviously, it's something that we haven't touched on. Please.
No, because I was thinking when Rolf was giving his talk this morning, and he was talking about the health crisis, and I was internally objecting to calling this a health crisis, because it is a crisis of a certain economic system that takes in and reaches out to the farthest reaches of natural ecosystems and exploits them. And so it's not just a health crisis like an act of God, like the risk industry often says, it happened. It didn't just happen, it was produced. It was manufactured by a global agricultural system that works in a certain kind of way. And I think we have to, Laura Spinney, the British science journalist, she wrote a wonderful article in The Guardian earlier this year, and said it took a whole world to produce the coronavirus. It's not just, Chinese wet markets or so. So there is a certain economic system behind that is feeding on certain lifestyles that we have in the global north. So we have to talk about this kind of systemic cause, and this is an economic cause for the coronavirus or so, and not just say, okay, it happened, because it's already happening again with the swine flu in Germany, for example, that is imported from Africa. So there is an economic system in place that is obviously producing one unsustainability after the other. And I think this has been exposed, and we have to now probably ask the bigger questions, how to change this economic system. 10 years ago, at the last crisis, we have a crisis every 10 years now, obviously, there was kind of a window of opportunity to change our financial systems. After 2 years or so, we were back to business as normal. And so I hope that this crisis will not, after 2 years, go back to as normal, but that we use this crisis to really change things. Maybe one final comment. Paul Gilding, many years ago, wrote a wonderful book, The Great Disruption. And he was referring also to climate change and the struggle to fight against climate change. And he compared this with the 1930s and the fight against Hitler. And he said Hitler had to invade 3 countries until we took this guy seriously and did something about it, and forgot all the cost-benefit analysis and said we have to win despite the costs. That was Churchill. And he was arguing that with climate change and everything connected to it, and biodiversity loss is also connected to it, there will also be such a moment when we know, okay, it's not about the costs anymore. The tipping points, we now passed some of them, and if we want to do something, we have to make much more drastic measures. And the crisis is always a good situation to try to come up with measures and change things and shake up things. So this is something that I hope that we will not go back to normal when this crisis will be over in a year or two.
Yes, so let's hope so.
Something on diversity, if you like. On biodiversity. Yes. So we are looking, I'm part of the project Drawdown Europe Research Association, and we're always looking at what's the most effective way, not just to reduce CO2 emissions, but to draw back CO2 emissions. And by far the most amazing project we've come across, again, Umweltbundesamt estimates 640 euros a ton is the total cost, only if you discount it with some imaginary discount rate, which says that the future of our children and grandchildren is not worthwhile, then you get to 180 or the 130 that is charged in Sweden. So 640 is the real number in a zero interest rate environment. If you take barren land in Australia and you reforest that, it costs you 200 euros a hectare. A hectare of land in Germany costs 20,000 euros. 200 euros for a hectare, 200 euros for the seedlings, 200 euros for a drone dropping the seedlings. And that grows into a forest which captures 100 tons of CO2 over 20 years. So you have a cost per ton of CO2 captures of 6 euros, very cheap. And then you get a grown forest, a biodiverse forest, and you can close again the gap between Perth and central Australia with the forest land. There's 200 million hectares of empty space, or 4 times the size of Germany, that could be reforested at a cost of 1/100th of the cost of society of a ton of CO2, plus the benefit of then owning a forest, which is probably worth 20,000. So it's a fantastic investment opportunity. The world is full of such opportunities. The system, without a CO2 tax and dividend, just doesn't work, and the old corrupt systems continue to stop people from investing the way they should. So a pension fund manager is scared to do something new. A bank advisor will give you advice to invest in X company's sustainable fund, which invests in Shell and British Petroleum under the so-called best-in-class approach, which is like taking the Moabit prison here in Berlin, and on Sunday you let out the nicest of the serial killers. That's called best in class.
Okay, thank you. That's one way to put it. Wow, I hadn't heard that. Thank you. There's many thoughts that will stay with us. I like to thank all of my guests for providing their insights today. It was truly inspiring to have you. Thanks. And I think they deserve a round of applause. And a question how homeowners could be incentivized to go solar. Merla Kubli from the university here has some interesting data on this. Please, Merla, here you are.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's my great pleasure to present you some insights on how we think a climate bonus on mortgages could help to close the solar investment gap. What I present to you are selected findings of the 10th Consumer Barometer of Renewable Energies, which was conducted in collaboration with Raiffeisen and Swiss Energy. The Consumer Barometer of Renewable Energy is conducted since the year 2011. And consists of a sample of 1,021 Swiss respondents. The sample is representative for the structure of Switzerland based on gender, age, education, the share of German and French-speaking people, as well as the education background and the share of homeowners. The data was collected in January and February of this year. And here I would like to show you some insights. Over the years, we repeatedly asked respondents what is their preferred electricity mix for Switzerland. And as you can see, solar power always continuously ranked very high in these preferences. In 2020, the share even reached 28% as the desired percentage. This stands in strong contrast to the current share we have in electricity, in the Swiss electricity mix, which makes only 4% for solar power. But it's not only the general population who is really interested in solar power, it's also the homeowners who actually think solar PV is a very attractive investment option, and there is a high interest for investing in rooftop solar. However, there's a larger share that is still rather at the undecided stage and has not turned their interest into action for investing into solar PV. So what is stopping homeowners from investing into solar PV? In this year's survey, we looked at the solar investment gap from a process view. We asked Swiss homeowners who are currently interested in renovating their house the following question. Imagine that you are currently renovating your house, taking out a mortgage for it. Which two options would you most likely give up in order to not exceed your budget? So as you can see from that question, we had a hypothesis that the solar investment gap has something to do with how homeowners set their priorities in the context of making their renovations. Our survey reveals that although solar PV is a very attractive investment option, that homeowners delete solar PV as one of the first options in case their budget is getting tight. A potential solution to that could be a climate bonus on mortgages. We wanted to test that in that survey, proposing to these homeowners the following situation. Imagine that your bank would offer you a bonus on your mortgage that would enable you to increase the amount of your mortgage to invest into climate-friendly renovations. Which of the following renovations would you conduct? And as you can see on this slide, actually 28% of homeowners would then, under this situation, decide to invest into solar PV. So this has a massive effect. But it's not only solar PV that could profit from a climate bonus, it's also, for instance, sustainable heating systems, as well as thermal insulation that would receive a boost from that measure. It is, however, only 10% who think even under these circumstances, they wouldn't want to borrow more money. So as we can see, that climate bonus could really help to contribute closing that solar investment gap. And then we try to open up the perspective and also ask consumers what they think about their bank. And here we see that 68% of the respondents actually would wish that their bank would engage more actively in financing clean energy projects, and that they wish more proactive offerings in this domain. So in light of these results, I am particularly excited to hear what our panelists think of the option of implementing a solar climate bonus for closing the solar investment gap. And if you're interested in further results of the 10th Consumer Barometer of Renewable Energy, you can find more results on the cuba.iwu.unisg.ch. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Merla. So with that, we dive into the conversation. I'd like to welcome Katrin Wehrle. She's head of the Department of Products and Investment Services at RISE-HSG Schweiz. And thank you. Then Christoph Baumann of the State Secretariat for International Finance, SIG. And from the Swiss Bankers Association, we have CEO Jörg Gasser. Good morning.
Good morning.
Also, later in the discussion, we'll hear from Charles Donovan. He's professor at Imperial College Business School in London. So first, Katrin Wehrle, we've heard it. Customers are interested in such a climate bonus. I assume that means that it will be available at Raiffeisen tomorrow.
It's already now available, not tomorrow, but since a couple of years. So what we see in the Swiss banking industry that a lot of different banks are already offering climate bonuses, meaning an increase in the interest rates if you want to investment into PV or sustainable heating systems. But we also at the same time see that the demand from the clients, which is a bit in contrast to what we see here, is not very big. Where we see the biggest point of attack for the topic is the awareness among homeowners. When we have engaged in discussions with clients, very often they don't know where to start. And they come at the moment where they need to renovate something. Starting at the very beginning of the renovation journey and understanding over the years what are the different items in their home they want to renovate and how to renovate it with PV, the sustainable heating system, the insulation. So what we did at Raiffeisen since already 2015, we had an active conversation together with the clients and helped them in modeling different scenarios and how they can renovate their building and also what is needed financing for it. And we see there is the biggest help for our clients in making their journey along renovations. And PV is one of the elements.
And that's at the Raiffeisen. What you offer, is there also a way to approach this in a more general matter within the banking industry? What comes to rules and regulations that are in place, Christoph Baumann?
Well, first of all, we welcome innovation in the financial industry very much when it supports sustainability. I think it's a big opportunity for the financial sector in general. And one of such innovations would be banks setting incentives for greener mortgages, as you just eloquently described. When it comes to regulatory framework, the Federal Council launched a report this summer, Sustainability in Switzerland's Financial Sector, and we assessed various measures, and one of the measures was also improved capital requirements for green investments, and we came to the conclusion that it's not an adequate approach and that we much prefer the banks or the market themselves to innovate.
The market themselves, that would be the banks. Now it's clear that the homeowners' investments in, for example, rooftop PV would contribute to reducing the carbon footprint of housing in Switzerland, but would it also benefit the financial sector as a whole, Jörg Gasser, by reducing the exposure to climate risk?
Yeah, absolutely. It will benefit the financial sector as a whole because it reduces risks. And as soon as you are able to reduce risks, the investment becomes more attractive. And from that point of view, the homeowner who wants to change his building, he will increase his value because he has invested considerable amounts of money into the renovation of his house. At the same time, he's reducing risks because he has a sustainable investment or made a sustainable investment. But I think what is decisive here is, as my colleague Katrin just said, there are many other factors that come into play. If myself, for example, apart from the fact I cannot invest in PV because I live in an old building, so this is already one of the framework conditions. This is not I am not allowed to invest in PV. There are other issues that are at stake. I mean, the fact with regard to mortgage is one point, but if you look at the interest rates that we need to pay now for mortgages is already quite low. As far as I know, those reductions that are given amount to about 0.5% maximum, which is not money, the amount of money that you can save. That's not a huge amount to save on the mortgage.
Just because you start from a very low base, right?
Yes. Other framework conditions that need to be fulfilled, for example. Area, for example, also with regard to the fact that you would like to store your energy that you produce on your rooftop. But I think there are many factors that are getting into the game. But however, to get back to your question, I mean, absolutely correct. These kind of policies and incentives that are given by approximately 30 of plants in Switzerland are certainly rules with regard to that. It should be promoted as much as possible.
Yes. Are you? How many banks are offering this kind of product?
Right.
Yes. What does the market look like? 30.
RISE. We have over 200 banks who create RISE. But as I said beforehand, the interest rates are so low at the moment. It's really awareness of the topic. It's a complete line along the journey of the renovation. It's really helping also planning their way for subsidies which are giving on the federal level, but they very often don't know where to start. So it's really helpful that they can help themselves.
Yes. Also, I would like to look at other investments in low carbon technology as well. Ones that retail investors, businesses could make. What about electric vehicles? For example, Mobility, the Swiss car-sharing company, recently announced that they intend to switch their entire fleet to electric within 10 years, but also in that statement, they pointed to financing charging infrastructure as one of the major obstacles. So what could be done about, I'd like to get this to all of you, what could be done to abate these kinds of problems?
Well, first of all, it's amazing to see the number of companies that implement strategies to green themselves, to green the supply chain and their core business itself. It's really beautiful to see how the demand, the ever-increasing demand from consumers and from investors has an impact on the companies. So it's not necessarily the regulation that has that impact, but it's actually the demand from their key stakeholders, I would say. And we see that in various areas. One of that is, you mentioned Mobility as a company, and we strongly welcome that. And yeah.
And we're now actively engaged in that discussion also with RISE-HSG. And for example, myself, I was switched to an e-car a couple of months ago together with my entire family. It was a big decision process, but I'm very comfortable with it. And we had some quite active discussions within RISE as well, how we want to shape the future of RISE around mobility as a company with our car fleet. We already have several RISE companies switched entirely to e-cars, but also, of course, from a financing perspective, we see that the demand is raising from the SME clients we're having, so we're supporting them in the financing decision on financing those
Is that financing of charging stations and such something that can come up from the demand you mentioned, or should there be a push on the public side as well to get the infrastructure done first?
It depends on the infrastructure. It depends very much. If it's a public good, then of course the government has a certain role to play. If not, one can wonder if this is really necessary. But especially with regard to infrastructure, I mean, every investor is very analog on his risks. And of course, if you have to decide to invest in e-mobility, for example, and hence in the infrastructure, of course the risks are allowed to diminish because the demand is here. It's also sustainable. Of course, it is sustainable much more than traditional mobility with regard to the cars. And from that point of view, it is, of course, advantageous to invest in these kinds of infrastructure. So that's not the question. What my point of view. The demand to invest in these kind of infrastructure projects is clear. The question is much more, and that was also the issue of the last panel, how to divest and getting out of infrastructure that is obsolete. Can you change it? Can you alter it? Can you put a system in place where it's alteration from an obsolete infrastructure into an infrastructure that has its future is possible? And here, to develop these kind of instruments is a growing market. There will be a niche in which the Swiss financial sector can penetrate.
Divestment, you mean?
Divestment.
If I may add to what has just been said, given this huge demand from the various stakeholders, I think one role the government can play is, or two roles better. First one is to really ensure that emissions are correctly priced into assets. I think that helps consumers because it helps the financial market to price in climate risk in their decision, or to take it into account in their decision making. And it's the most efficient tool. So we have in our arsenal, I would say. The other thing is to increase transparency in the real economy. So there is a lot of demand from investors and consumers, but there's not always the means to make a decision because data is not there, or it's not decision ready, or it's not comparable internationally. So I think that's a key area we can work on, and where the government can have a role to promote that.
Yeah, exactly. Just to add on that, from a financing perspective, for us, is that data transparency is extremely important, so we can incorporate it in decision-making processes around capitalization and financing. On the other hand, as well, it's not just the financing part, it's also investment part, so we offer our clients a good range of investments in sustainable investment vehicles. Therefore, data transparency structure is also helpful because there's a big jungle, and sustainable is not the same as sustainable. So whatever there is more data and more kind of model which is proof, that helps us as a financial industry to guide the clients and also construct the right investment vehicles for clients.
And if I just may add, the quality of the investment, transparency and taxonomy is crucial because you have certain players in the world market, and here I'm talking about the US. They're very quick and fast in proposing green bonds and green investments, but in fact they aren't. It has been mentioned just before. The EU is with its taxonomy is doing this as well, and we believe that we must be better on that. So a Swiss finish on the quality of those green financial products must be implemented as fast as possible, and it will be done because we had just yesterday we had our board meeting with the association. And it has been decided that explicitly that on green investments, on investments that are sustainable, we would like to have a Swiss finish in order to become the leading financial marketplace in the world. So we must be better than the EU, and we are already better than the US, but we must clearly be beyond the quality that the EU is offering in order to really occupy that niche, which will be soon not be a niche anymore, but a very fast-growing market.
So to be able to also define what sustainability actually means.
Exactly, that's decisive. We are very much geared towards the EU taxonomy, but that's only one. That gives a certain quality with regard to the products and how to evaluate them. But as a Swiss financial market, we would like to go beyond and really be able to introduce and offer products that satisfy the highest standards.
Not only light green, not only light green.
Not only light green or dark or brown green as the US is proposing.
Okay. If I may add to that, so when we talk about disclosures or transparency, you always have two areas. One is the real economy, and the other one is, as you mentioned, financial products and the advisory process of financial institutions. And I think, especially on the real economy, it's important to have as much as possible an international alignment to avoid regulatory fragmentation, especially for the largest companies in the market. Otherwise, you end up in a situation where they have to report 3 or 4 different frameworks, and it becomes just an administrative nightmare, potentially. So I think wherever possible, we should align, but I agree that wherever it makes sense, we should have a pragmatic approach as well. And that's certainly going to be one of the largest focus on our side in the coming years, how to align ourselves with these international developments, especially the European Union, I would say.
I also would like to get the point of view from London now at this point. Charles Donovan, I hope you can hear us.
Now I can hear you. Hello.
Well.
Good morning.
Good morning. So stability was one of the words that came up this morning, and it's a magic word, obviously, in financial markets. But climate change, obviously, being a very destabilizing force. What do you think are the options here for financial markets?
So it's a really interesting discussion that you've been having there. Let me just say, just as background, so I work, I'm a professor of finance at Imperial College London. I hear a bad echo there, so I'm not sure whether that's as bad for you as it is for me.
We can hear you well.
Okay, good. And we have I run a center called the Center for Climate Finance and Investment that sits within the business school. We spend a lot of time looking at this interface of between regulation and the financial system, and a lot of interest in the comments about innovation. I think the challenge is that we're at the moment still very much at the point where we're, if you look at the green market as it is, there have been some wonderful advances. But you have to always ask the question, if these are such great ideas, why are they not happening? Why are we not seeing more progress on this in this space? And I think a lot of it comes to the fact that there are other parts of the regulatory framework that are really working against sustainable finance that need to be overcome. That relates to pensions regulation, that relates to banking regulation. Certainly, the frameworks for Basel III do no favor to a lot of this, and clearly the EU has tried to move forward with that. And the green taxonomy is a very interesting starting point. But I think that the point has to be that banks and the rest of the financial system have a responsibility. They will have to enact, get ahead of the curve on the opportunities here. But fundamentally, governments still are not putting in place the kind of policies that would allow for a green economy to really flourish. And it would be a bit naive of us all, as people who have worked in finance, to think that green finance can really flourish without an underlying green economy. And so there are certainly, new approaches that can be taken, but I think that we're still missing, there are still some big gaps in terms of creating linkages between, energy policy, environmental policy, financial policy, central banking policy. I think these are the crucial issues now to allow some of these great ideas to really take root.
Also, when it comes to divesting that you mentioned before, and it's something that the climate movement is strongly arguing for. We have seen some high-profile announcements in Switzerland lately, but no real big shift from way that's not well.
I mean, the figures are clear. We were just 2 years ago, we had 11% or 15% investment in these kind of products. Now it's almost 20% within 1 year.
But if you look at the Swiss National Bank, for example, compared to the Bank of England, or also the European Investment Bank, that they have a different kind of programs. Let's ask London about the view from outside. How do you compare the Swiss in this field to the rest of Europe and the UK? Charles Donovan?
So we've seen, this year obviously was going to be a huge year in the UK with the first climate-related stress test of the financial system. That stress test was not yet going to be a test of capital adequacy. The bank was very clear about that. But it was, just before the COVID crisis hit, I have personally never seen the amount of movement amongst banks as there was in the 6 months between the launch of the discussion paper and the formalization of the exercise. So it's a clear signal that when the most important actors in the system begin to set a direction, others will follow. And there's no clearer strategic priority for banks, other than when the regulator begins to talk about risk-weighted assets and what kind of regulatory capital will be required. So I think it is a very important lever. That said, there are a number of things that can still be done outside of, in terms of the innovation space. So, for example, when you go to buy a washing machine at a department store or electronics store in Switzerland, you would, or in the UK, you would never expect to have to pay for all of that up front. So there's been a huge amount of innovation in consumer goods around leasing, around consumer credit. It still is not spilling over into, by and large, into the renewable energy sector. So I love the idea of green mortgages, and certainly Barclays here in the UK was quite an innovator in that. And I think that the real punchline is that they are finding that the default risk on those loans is lower, and therefore, from a pure credit perspective, it makes sense for them to be able to charge those at a slightly lower rate. And I think that's the template, is finding where credit risk really leads us to a realization that there are opportunities in helping to finance these kinds of assets.
Yeah, there's a follow-up. I would say like this. The Swiss system is quite bottom-up. There's no top-down big strategy from the government. It's quite based on voluntary actions from institutions, and so it's sometimes harder to see the change. But I would completely agree with Mr. Gasser that there's been a tremendous amount of change development over the last couple of years. From a regulatory perspective, one example is the implementation of TCFD recommendations in the economy, but also by financial institutions. Another example is the Pacta Climate Alignment tests, where we're now running this year for the second time after 2017, this time also with next to pension funds and insurance companies, also asset managers and banks. And while the results are not yet out, I can say that we will have for the first time, I think, a representative data for the entire economy. And it's a huge number of institutions have voluntarily joined and made these tests. So I think there's a lot of development there. Yes, the Bank of England is leading when it comes to climate risk research, and is doing their really good job. And it's the first central bank which has implemented this year the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure recommendations. The Swiss National Bank and FINMA, the regulator, are closely working within the network of green financial system on climate risks. So I wouldn't say nothing is happening. It might be less visible.
You agree?
Yeah, just to add on that, we see it as a financial institution, probably in general, but especially for RISE-HSG, we see it as a duty to take into account climate change-related risks in our investment decisions, and of course also in investment vehicles. So we see it not for the future. We don't see like you can choose you want to invest responsibly, sustainably or not. It's just one part of the decision-making criteria in our investment advisory process in the future. So for us, it's clear it's a duty. It's not we want or not. It's not going to be a differentiation part anymore in the future. It's just going to be there, and we're really working towards that direction.
And as you said, the man is here. So this is a good opportunity also to allow some questions. I'd like to start with our in-person attendees here at Volkswagen. So is there anything you'd like to ask in this regard? Questions in the room? Not Pascal? I guess we will have some online. Yes. Not sure that one's working.
It's working, but make sure it works. All right, any questions from the floor? Not yet, maybe one up here, right? Please. Hello.
So it's not really a question, but you said change is happening. My question is it happening fast enough? Like, do you think, and are you doing like enough, or do you think there's room for improvement?
Yes. Please, Mr. Gasser, I will hold it for you as well.
Thank you. You would probably expect that I tell you, yes, it's fast enough, yes, there is enough movement in the whole sector of sustainability. But my answer is not that. I say, no, we are not fast enough. No, it's that we don't do enough. Yeah, I completely agree with that, because that's exactly the Achilles heel. Because what we say is that we would like to have market forces set in place, and the market will regulate and solve the issue. I believe that's not the case. That's not. We are, with regard to the speed, we are not fast enough. I just mentioned that the figures are very impressive. They're rising up very fast, but still much too slow. The question is now, how can we speed up the issue, or how can we speed up the dynamics that I say? Now, one possibility would be just to regulate and to ask the SIF to put the legal framework in place. The other possibility would be self-regulation, and that's exactly what we try to do in the banking sector. We have issued, or we are about to still continue to issue guidelines in order to speed up the process, because the guidelines are much faster put in place than the regulatory framework that will be contested. We will have a referendum. It takes at least 2 to 5 years until we can really get any changes. So you have to bring the market to the point where they are ready to self-regulate themselves. And that's exactly what we try to do from the Banking Association. We're probably not that successful yet, although I'm in a position, I must tell you that we're extremely successful with regard to our guidelines, but we could be done more. I agree with you. But also, the framing conditions must be set in a way that speeds up the process as well. There are many issues of the framework, the legal framework that can be done, but that takes simply too long. Pension funds were mentioned, the guidelines, how you have to invest, or how you're able to invest as a pension fund into sustainable products. Well, these regulations make it extremely difficult to invest easily into sustainable financial products. But look at the situation in Parliament. We will probably not be able to change these guidelines quick enough in order to really develop the market. Tax is another issue. We just need to abolish stamp duty. If we abolish the stamp duty, our whole capital market will move back into Switzerland. We have lost. And we could really use this capital market in order to invest into sustainable products. But the stamp duty will not be abolished. It takes too long. So the only way that we have to speed up the process is through self-regulation. And so this is exactly what we try to do.
All right, thank you very much. Discussion?
Maybe you want to... Just one addition to that, and in generally I agree with that, and what you said. One area where we have sped up quite a bit is the CO2 levy, or the carbon greenhouse gas emissions. And there, with the revision of the new CO2 law, we almost doubled the maximum allowed CO2 levy from $120 to $220 roughly. And we're now already one of the leading countries, when not the leading country when it comes to the CO2 levy, and that's a way where we have now the legal framework to really efficiently incentivize the market correctly, or to efficiently have carbon being priced into assets. I think that might not, again, it's not as visible because it's a hidden levy in the background. You as a consumer don't notice it necessarily, but in our view, it has a very, very smooth and direct effect.
Okay. All right, one question from Professor Rolf.
Thank you. I have a question about the idea of self-regulation. I don't know of too many examples where self-regulation was really helpful in addressing an urgent problem. So I think about, for example, the question about should we wear masks in public transport. There was the opportunity for everybody to kind of self-regulate and wear a mask, but if I compare my experience on a train the day before the federal government imposed it and the day after, it was a tremendous difference. So I'm just wondering, what makes you confident that that self-regulation will address this problem quickly enough?
Very good point. But luckily, at our association, at least, we have 500 persons who work on those self-regulations. They're represented from Lighthouse and from all other banks in Switzerland. So if we produce a self-regulatory framework, it is usually discussed eternally and epically within the banking sector. Once we get out with it, then it's usually in consensus, and it is implemented. At the beginning, when I started out at the Bankers Association, I thought the same as you did. Well, I give you guidelines, but who cares at the end of the day? That's not the case. And with regard to the masks, the difference with regard to the Swiss population in our association is that in our association we really try to find a solution that somehow requires the green light from each and every bank in order to put out these regulations, self-regulations, and then it is adhered to. Whereas within the Swiss population, of course, you will never have this kind of consensus. And as I said, the whole process starts with the decision of the board. As I said before, 2 days ago, we decided in the board of the Swiss Banking Associations, all the big banks are represented by their chairperson. So the Verwaltungsratspresident is part of their board. If they say that we want to have a sustainable marketplace with regard to quality, it's clearly beyond the leverage or beyond the measuring rod that is put out by the European Union, then it is put in place, and we will become better quite fast. We have now this possibility to go beyond and develop guidelines that will make sure that we reach that goal. So from that point of view, I'm quite optimistic. And with regards to sustainable finance, these guidelines that we put in place, they took 4 to 5 months, and then they were out. So we were quite fast, nevertheless, with regard to or compared to the normal legislative procedure that you have to stick to. As I said, it takes 2 to 5 years.
Let me follow up on that. So we have to have this discussion within hundreds of institutions. Isn't it given that you come out with these common denominator?
This danger exists indeed, but if you have the board who decides on what goal needs to be achieved, then of course we cannot come back to the board and tell them, sorry, we were unable to fulfill it because you're against it. If this is the case, then the board will decide what direction they will take. And since with regard to sustainability, they have clearly decided to go for a Swiss finish, then we are mandated and we are obliged to go beyond.
Well, I clearly see that we need both ways to really advance sustainably overall, but also advance fast enough. But I also see it go back to the point of awareness in the general public. I think the awareness is just not yet there. We see that banks are trying to position sustainable investment, sustainable financing, and at the top of their agenda. We see a lot of clients are already coming to us, but not enough clients yet who are asking actively about sustainability, investment, financing decisions, etc. So for me, it's also really a question about the raising awareness in the Swiss populations for the topic. So it's about the offering and also the amount of impact. And I think there, of course, regulations can help because suddenly the press is covering the topic. There is a public discussion about those type of investments and developments. So I think it's both ways to go.
Yes, and also the definition of what sustainable means that we talk about. Do we have more questions?
Not from the floor, I think.
Okay, let's check our online audience as well. We will forget about them.
Of course not, but online, unfortunately, we are experiencing some echoes, but we're very strongly working on it.
Maybe they're all already Googling for climate-friendly investments.
We have one question. We have one question online. I will gladly raise from a former participant. So it's to Charlie. Charlie Donovan mentioned existing regulatory challenges and the gaps between climate, renewables, finance, and banking policies. What would be the main changes or actions that are needed today for a better green finance environment? Awesome question. Charlie, maybe directly, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, it's a very good follow-up question. Maybe a couple of comments there. First is, it's interesting to observe that in Switzerland you have an opportunity that in the UK and the US we simply do not, which is you have a smaller country, a country that is much better knitted in by culture and social relationships, and so the opportunity for a more consensual, let's say, approach towards these issues, I think, is a lot higher than it would be in those countries, because we see, for example, in the US, we see, particularly the green market has been really created a lot of fracture in the sense that you can have, a bank like JP Morgan, which is the largest fossil fuel bank in the US, at the same time, making huge strides in green bond issuance. And that's just, it's incoherent. It will, for a while, that will work. And that, but at some point it just, people will see that doesn't make sense. So in terms of, how can we kind of get out of that deadlock, I think having high level targets is a big part of it. So in the UK, having announced a clear and putting into legislation carbon budgets and a net zero commitment, the old saying that if you don't know where you're going, you're never going to get there. And so this has been a big part, and I've seen a huge change in the conversation with simply that sense of target setting being enshrined now in legislation. The second thing I think can start to unlock this is that, and back to my point about, about as JP Morgan as the example, is that we really need unitary standards. Guidelines are great. Guidelines particularly, could work very well in a country like Switzerland, but for slightly more chaotic countries like the US, really it just comes down to some set of minimum standards. And I think that as we go forward, we're going to have some minimum rate. Financed emissions is going to become a much bigger topic. And there's going to have to be transition policies that are in place within banks that speak to the exact situation of their clients in different sectors. But we can't just be sort of hopping around and doing good here and not so good there. And so minimum standards, and this is developing, say in terms of global banks and their reluctance now and clear statements of policy about being unwilling to finance thermal coal. And I think that the next step there is to really get to sector by sector some minimum thresholds for what simply is not just unacceptable from a political point of view, but really poses too much of a credit risk to be involved in financing clients who are not demonstrating a minimum level of change towards targets.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Not from the online audience, no. But
okay.
Maybe from the room.
I think Rolf Wüstenhagen has one.
Oh, of course, yes. Please.
Having such a great set of panelists here, I can't resist the temptation to ask another question. I appreciate that Switzerland works differently than other countries in terms of the tradition of self-regulation, and so sort of that kind of command and control thing that works in, I don't know, France might not work here. But then this idea that Giles Donovan mentioned that's been done in the UK of the Bank of England to do stress testing. I mean, that sounds like something that's not necessarily command and control, but in fact could help banks to understand the very fundamental financial risks that come from climate change. So I was wondering whether there would be a consensus on the panel that it might be a good idea to have these kinds of stress tests, and if so, who should be offering them for Swiss banks?
Stress tests? Well, first of all, in the PACTA climate alignment tests, which the banks, asset managers, pension funds, and insurances are doing, I think there's the option also to do certain stress tests. You have to understand that stress tests, the kind of that Bank of England do, are focused on climate risks. So the risks climate pose on the institutions, which doesn't really say a lot about what the impact of the institution is on the climate. The thinking there is, I believe, is that when a company integrates the risk thinking about climate, they will also have a discussion internally about the impact, and certain risks, for instance, transition risks, are to some degree also linked to the impact the company has. So we appreciate, or we welcome that development quite a bit. We're in close discussions with the UK also on that topic. Maybe what can the Swiss government do? Maybe it's helpful a bit to see the process we're right in. So I mentioned before that this summer we launched, the Federal Council launched a report. Earlier this year, two technical expert groups were initiated together with the industry representatives as well. One was focused on risks and systemic risks, and the other one was focused on transparency and fiduciary duties. And whilst I can't tell you in detail the conclusion, I would say that the general direction is that there is a clear need for decision-ready information in the real economy, and which is also internationally comparable. So initiatives like the TCFD are very interesting from our perspective. There, the problem is, I mentioned decision already. So you have lots of institutions worldwide who are TCFD supporters. I think the last number was something like 1,020 or so. But when you look at the disclosures themselves, not everything is decision ready. So there's lots of text, not necessarily lots of comparable data. And when, it's also one of the conclusions that the FSB or the TCFD Secretariat mentioned in the status report. It's something they're now working on in the revision of the TCFD, how to address this issue. And there we see lots of potential. So how can we really get data that's internationally comparable and that's useful for decisions, both on the real economy and also on financial products? Because as an investor in financial products, I might want to be able to make a good choice. You also have to understand that the focus is currently primarily on climate. Now more and more discussion starts on biodiversity as well, but we're years behind the climate discussion, and it is arguably also more complex. Yesterday, we started the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures, which is not mandated by the FSB. It's an initiative by the UK and Swiss government and by Worldwide Fund, Canopy, and UNEP FI, with roughly 60 financial institutions and from the real economy as well. So where we try to catch up a bit to the developments of TCFD, but we're at the beginning there. And the focus of the TCFD is on risks. We haven't had yet international conclusive discussion on how to measure impact. I think the measurements are, the discussions are very much ongoing, and it's too early to say what is then the standard or what's then the consensus of that. It's very much more difficult, I would say, to come up with one than on the risk side. So I appreciate what I want to say. In short, I appreciate very much the work the Bank of England is doing in that regard, but they only look at one part of the picture, and the other part still is very much under discussion.
From a bank perspective, about stress testing, be it about the risk factor or the impact factor, I think we would welcome it. If we really take a topic serious, we're also open to be measured against it and develop ourselves against the targets we see there. So if there's a standard and proven way of stress testing along the lines which Christoph just mentioned, we would be very open to apply it, and we really want to learn, we take it serious. So we're also open and transparent about the topic.
All right, an openness towards being tested. Another test, right, apart from the financial stability, also the climate stress test. I think it's a good point now to take another short break before our final round. What do you think? Coffee? I realized there's soy milk there, so that's a good thing. Yeah, it's a little things too. This will last until 11:45, so we'll have a little, just shyly more time than we had before, and we'll be back here at 11:45 discussing digital energy after COVID-19. So see you in a bit. Thank you. All right, good to have you back with us here in the room and via Zoom here at the REMforum 2020. We've touched on a lot of important aspects this morning regarding the transformation to renewables. Now we want to talk more about the disruption that we're all witnessing currently, COVID-19, and what the repercussions will be for the energy sector, for supply and demand, for production and innovation. Here to discuss this are Siegfried Handschuh, professor at the Institute of Computer Science here at the University of St. Gallen. So you have a home turf advantage, so to speak. And Matthias Gallus, the head of the Digital Innovation Office at the Swiss Federal Office of Energy. Welcome. And coming to us via video call are from the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, Professor Verena Tiefenbeck. She's an expert in digital transformation. And Fabienne Muff, she's co-founder of Carbon Removed, which is involved in CO2 reduction from Iceland to Nepal. Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, very good. So I start with you. It's fascinating. Just quickly, you say going carbon negative is actually a viable option for a lot of businesses. How exactly does that work?
So there are several negative emission technologies, and that's what our startup does basically. We are not focusing on emission reductions, but on carbon removal. So we want to tackle the excess of CO2, which is already in the atmosphere. I mean, even if we would reduce all our emissions to zero now, there would be still an excess, which causes the climate crisis. Maybe to your question, a few examples. Olivine stones is a enhanced weathering, the method is called. They take out CO2, or there is direct air capture and storage. There is a spin-off of ETH, which we work together with, called Climeworks. They have a plant in Iceland where they take out the CO2 and pump it underground, where it will mineralize and form basalt stone. But the simplest method is probably afforestation. So to name a few.
Very good, thank you. So you were actually the magic bullet that Charlie Wilson mentioned this morning.
Yeah, exactly. Well, no, we say it's not the magic bullet, really. We say our philosophy is there is no magic bullet, and we should reduce as much as possible and do all we can. But we think we should also support a variety of removal methods. I think we should try with every technology we have and then give our best.
Do one without neglecting the other. So now the coronavirus has changed the way we all work and the way we commute, the way we vacation, at least for the time being. And I'd like to hear from all of you now how the pandemic has just impacted your own professional life since March. I'd like to know that, Secret Handschuh.
Yes, first of all, the observation that it led to a very fast digital transformation. So in the past, when we wanted to do stuff like that, we had a lot of naysayers, or what we call in German Bedenkenträger, and with Corona, all of a sudden, we could roll out and it works. And we see that we have a strong increase of home office. So the university used to have a 20% of home office. Now we had, during the Corona crisis, something like 60. At the moment, we have around 40. So that also did set my research group at home, which transformed my home, because my office at home looks now like a film studio. I have a green screen and I have cameras and I have key lights, and I do the video editing at home in order to prepare for the teaching. I did a lot of teaching material now digital, where I have produced movies and so on.
So you got an influencer set up there.
Actually, yes, my daughter is already asking if she can use that later.
Thought so. So maybe Verena Tiefenbeck, do you have witnessed similar changes?
Well, I'm not on the influencer spectrum yet, I guess, but yeah, well, I think I'm doing research and teaching. It's probably one of the professions where obviously we have a lot of change, but I mean, compared to other sectors that's, where people really, or where a lot of companies are really struggling, I think we're still in a pretty fortunate situation. In my particular case, I used to travel quite a bit, especially between Zurich and Nuremberg in the last year. And obviously those things have become more difficult now. And I also think in terms of, onboarding new team members, that is obviously a challenge. Like I had 2 new doctoral students who I had to send home to home office after 2 weeks. Well, 2 weeks after they had started. I mean, things like that are obviously not easy, but I think compared to the situation that a lot of companies are facing, we're in kind of a privileged role.
What about you, Montes Carlos? Are you also in a privileged role?
Well, certainly it has changed our professional lives at the Federal Office of Energy. Besides all that has been mentioned and said so far, which actually was for me the same, I would like to add here, and if you've seen recently and still now, if I look in this room here. So for instance, we used to have many expert groups working on different topics with external stakeholders. Usually we would have physical meetings. So people would come to the federal office, visit us. We would have a large meeting with maybe 20, 30 people visiting us there, looking for parking spots, using the train and so on. And this, of course, has caused in the past a lot of emissions and also infrastructure usage and wear. And this has just been gone. And we became much more flexible in scheduling these meetings and having the input that we need via digital tools, may it be Microsoft Teams or other WebEx or stuff like that. And more this kind of hybrid working leads to an increase of output and also of knowledge sharing, which is a positive effect. One challenge that was already mentioned by Verena had the same issue. In fact, new team members were onboarding, and then it was very hard to integrate them in the team or in the division and the whole federal office. But what I found helped a lot is really to put them in projects that were up and running. They had to communicate with colleagues, they had to schedule meetings, and step by step they kind of grew their network. But then it takes more time than if they would be there physical. By now it's very much more flexible. We used to have 4 to 5 days of there at the office physically. Now we use those new tools, and it became much more flexible with more home office and also more working from the distance, from the train and so on.
Mm-hmm. Lastly, Fabian Moff, I understand that you also developed your business, Carbon Removed, during this pandemic. How was that?
Yeah, actually we did. So we started with the startup 2019, but then towards the end. And then in April or March, COVID hit us as well, and the lockdown. And actually we were quite surprised, because we were already used as a young startup to work from our home office and to work together digitally and coordinate digitally. So we already benefited from the saved commuting time, from custom working environment and the flexibility. COVID still changed or still affected my professional life a lot, because before COVID, I had a lot of meetings, courses, and events, which made me travel a lot within Switzerland. And they all suddenly went online. So I had a lot of freed up time from this business travel. Also, I had less social things going on, so more time from there. I worked out more, I ate healthier, and the effect was then basically that I was much more on my computer. I worked way longer hours and was way more productive, and my co-founder as well. And we managed to pivot during that time. The pivot was not because of COVID, but something that had to happen anyway, and got an online platform production ready during lockdown. And yeah, that was quite an achievement, and we are very happy about that. So we benefited a bit from lockdown, so to say. But there were also like disadvantages, like I wouldn't want to have that lack of social contacts for much longer. But yeah, it was very productive.
We all feel you there. So there's quite substantial impacts in the immediate sense, but it's not clear which elements of this are going to be temporary and what in fact is going to be a new normal. What's your take on this, Verena Tiefenbeck?
My take is that I think a lot of the things in the short term are even positive. I mean, some of the things that have been brought up already, or for instance, the fact that we can participate in this meeting as panelists remotely. But I think actually in the long run, there's a lot of costs that aren't visible yet. And so I have rather mixed feelings about, oh yeah, let's now all go, virtual, and let's have meetings in general virtually, because I think, it's easy to add my 2 cents here virtually on a panel, but I think the more important things of conferences, of gatherings and so on are a lot of the informal things happening around, like, the conversations you have with people during the coffee break. Also, meeting people and meeting new people, meeting people you're already familiar with. And a lot of the informal discussions also within a team where, over lunch break, you would discuss some things, or where you would simply walk over to the office next door and ask a colleague a question. And I think the barrier to actually raise that question, like to call somebody or to, reach out to somebody via some online tools, I think the barrier is much harder. And I think in the long run, we will see costs on things like creativity and development of processes. So I think that a lot of the operational things can be done very well from home offices and in these kind of formats. But I think in the long run, hopefully, we will have the chance again to face each other more and to have more interactions.
Certainly, and I would also like to mention, as Rolf said at the beginning, that we try to replicate these exchanges in our coffee breaks online. And also a quick reminder that if you're participating via Zoom, there is the comment form that you can join the discussion later on. So we try to do our best to facilitate these kinds of things. Matthias Gallus, you deal with digital innovation on a constant basis. So it must be also kind of exciting to witness this sudden shift now, no?
Absolutely. We, as we all mentioned so far, this shift has been going on so fast now due to the measures that were necessary, that it was tremendous to see how many activities were launched in the area of digitalization in general, may it be collaboration platforms for working, but also the sensitivity of or the understanding what kind of role digitalization may play in the future in different sectors, specifically also in the energy sector, how much more on efficiency we could gain using digital solutions and digital tools. I think it was mentioned already. So before we were testing so many tools in order to introduce them into our daily work life, and this took maybe years. And there was always a nay, it's not possible because of security reasons, because of other reasons, because it's hard to integrate. And then suddenly it was possible within 2 or 3 months. So the number of projects that are still being launched in that area, in diverse areas, is constantly rising, and the interest is also constantly rising on how we can utilize the potential that digitalization is offering also in the future.
There's interest, and then there's behavior with the accelerated use of digital technology. Actually, does that increase acceptance of other things like smart grids or autonomous vehicles and such? Siegfried Handschuh?
That's a good question. What I can say is I think public transport has changed for the moment. I avoid public transport. I moved, in my personal case, to e-bike in order to stay fit. I presume hence that the transportation patterns has changed in general, which might, I hope, increase the acceptance of something like autonomous vehicles. May or may not. I also think that since we're in the energy forum here, that the energy consumption pattern must have changed because people do more home office, so we might have more energy users not in the office, but in the regional area, and I also found that we at the university, when we have meetings, we walk less through the city from one institute to the others, but we have more online meetings. So it's less, we save time and sweat that way.
But that's all out of a necessity. The question is also if attitudes change when it comes to energy consumption. I mean, it was also a time of reflection for a lot of people, how they live their lives. Do you see anything of that sort?
It's not quite my area, the energy. We would have to ask Rolf about that. But what I can see is the acceptance for tools has increased a lot. In the past, it was very tricky, as he said, to say, let's do a video conference. And we even had to agree on the tool. You just say, oh, let's use Teams, and everybody all of a sudden seems to know how to use it. So this kind of ad hoc connections with people became much easier than before. But I can only speak for the communication side of things. So,
okay, maybe Fabian Muft, have you seen people being more aware of these things lately?
Yeah, I would say so. So I have always tried to keep up with technology for myself. but there is like a huge increase in how I saw like friends, family, but also in business. Suddenly everything seems more accessible. Distances between continents are much smaller. So because virtual meetings are much more accepted, so suddenly a call with the US or with Canada seems much more natural, because it would be very similar if it's with Switzerland and the EU or something. And yeah, I think I've seen a lot happening also like in the free time area, like Netflix, Spotify, Shopify. Also all their like the demand rised so much, and also the stock prices of all of those companies skyrocketed. But also companies like DocuSign, Apple, Dell. So basically all companies offering any services which help during lockdown, if business or free time, they just, yeah, they were really succeeding. But yeah.
Yeah, that's something we all witnessed, that there are winners always in a crisis. And this time, big tech companies like Zoom or Amazon, Facebook, they're gaining more importance, even more importance than they had before. What are the implications there, Matthias, Carlos?
I think they become more and more aware of what is their potential in to grow more and come up with innovative products on the market. Also in the area of sustainability, we had the discussion before. Big tech companies also look towards sustainable solution in energy. So, for instance, the centers where data is stored, they are fully supplied by a couple of companies with renewable energies, and they also promote that on a worldwide scale. So that's certainly a good thing. Maybe coming back to the role of digitalization in the energy sector and the acceptance of smart grids and such, I think there are two points to make. So number one, what we can clearly see on a political level is the concern of energy consumption or electricity consumption by digitalization, that this can explode and would have certain effects on infrastructure as we know it of today. What is a little bit not seen in this debate is, of course, the benefits that we already mentioned. So we use infrastructure less, we travel less CO2 impact in other sectors, in mobility sector, and less aviation and so on. So this debate is getting started right now. The other topic would be very much technology driven in the infrastructure, so smart grids and so forth. I could not, let's say, feel that there was a big shift or big change going on suddenly due to COVID. And this is certainly due to let's say, natural risk averseness there in order to keep the security of supply as high as possible. So change that is happening or could happen there is usually much slower than maybe in other sectors, as we know, sectors in the internet economy, Facebook and so on. So there's a big difference.
Interesting. So sort of a revert to the mean towards the stability that you know you can count on. Maybe Verena Tiefenberg, have you seen something similar there?
Well, I think one of the things that the crisis shows is that change is possible and at a very fast pace. So, for instance, I mean, I don't think that when we talk, for instance, about the uptake of services related to smart metering or so, I don't think there's a direct shift from some of the things that we see from we now all have video calls and so on. But at the same time, what really makes me optimistic is to see how fast we accept a new reality, or to what extent many people actually are able to accept a new reality. So, I mean, a couple of months ago, for all of us, it would have been almost inconceivable to enter a supermarket with a breathing mask in our face. And now it kind of feels normal. And I mean, hopefully that's not something that's going to stay around for long. But I think when we talk about things like the adoption of all sorts of things related to the smart grid in the energy sector, a lot of people do embrace the energy transition and a lot of the goals of it. But I mean, they do maybe not necessarily realize what this implies in terms of flexibility or in terms of that this could mean dynamic prices also for households. And I think seeing how fast people were able to deal with new circumstances now in the corona situation makes me kind of hopeful that at least a decent share of the population will also make the shift or go on board with a lot of the new requirements of the energy transition. And I mean, once you have a substantial share of the population that's actually participating or that's actually accepting these new things, I think then it's a question of time that it actually also will spread to a larger and larger share of the population.
So that's a rather positive outlook. I also want to talk about one of the more problematic sides of digitalization. We see a vast amount of disinformation online, both regarding the pandemic now or directed at elections, the US presidential election just being one example. And of course, on the topic of climate change, there has always been disinformation. So I'll stay with you, Verena Tiefenbeck. What can be done to have an informed debate in the age of social media about such topics?
I wish I had an answer to that. Well, I mean, I guess although we see, of course, a lot of, potential for populist opinions and conspiracy theories and so on, a lot of danger through that. At the same time, it's never been that easy to also, inform ourselves from different sources and not only to, buy what our one newspaper that we've subscribed to in the past was kind of echoing, but I mean, we have the possibility at least to gather information from different sources. The question is rather to what extent people really do that, and because there's this general tendency of people to actually just read news sources that confirm their pre-existing opinions.
Confirmation bias, exactly.
Yeah.
And also whether they are able to distinguish good quality sources from rather bad quality ones. Siegfried Hanschel, do you think that the general public, especially when it comes to scientific information, will make that distinction?
Well, let me first start with my observation that social media was not built for a political debate. It's more like a billboard where more or less the guy who shouts the loudest gets the most likes.
That's also my experience.
Yes, actually, because the debate actually means argumentation, right? So you make a claim and you have a support and so on and so forth. What actually missing is a social media for this kind of political debate where you actually struggle in a debate to find the truth or some version of we can all agree on. Yes, consensus. The existing social media is not built for that. It's not even very good in supporting the rhetoric structures and so on. I happen to be a computer scientist, and with that I happen also to be a computational linguist, so I'm very interested in the language side of things. And we do train our students computationally to improve their argumentation skills. So when they write text, the system gives you a feedback if you did a proper claim, if you did a proper support, and so on and for that. So I think that's probably, if you want to have a good debate with the help of digital technology, we need something like that. But let's also have a look in what can we do with the existing media. We think about fake news detection and stuff like that, but that's a tricky business because that means you need a ground truth, right? So because all the measurements we have are statistical. So of course we can find outliers, somebody who is making claims which are outside of the mainstream, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's wrong or he's lying, right? So fake news detection is tricky, but then it was also mentioned this kind of confirmation bubbles or echo chambers, as we call them, right?
there we thought it could be interesting experiment, or let's first start with the observation. In the echo chamber, people like only information which kind of reinforces their belief they already have, which means as long as you're in one of those echo chambers in social media, as diverse it can get. And we could think about an experiment where we identify those bubbles and feed them with statements from the opposition on purpose, and see if that might improve their open-mindedness, or maybe not. I'm not sure, but it would be an interesting experiment in any case.
Yes, I wonder if it's also a little bit generational, that younger people who spend much more time online, that they have sort of a trained eye when it comes to being a little skeptic with the information they're confronted with. Maybe Fabian Muff, you said you spend a lot of time on your computer. How do you go about that, distinguishing actual real information, scientific information? I'm sure you don't have a problem identifying that, but also in your circle of friends, how do they inform themselves? Do you think they do it in a way that is actually sustainable in the sense of information consumption?
So first of all, I agree that social media should not be the source of information. And then it is certainly good if you go to different news providers and compare a bit, stay critical. And I think in my environment of friends, all are quite critical, and we also have good discussions. So there, I think we don't have a big problem of like believing some, I don't know, some misinformation. We can spot it quite easily, I would say. But I really think it's a huge issue, and it's a huge danger. And I think Facebook should be held accountable. And also something interesting, what happened to me recently, we started to with our startup. We started to make. We wanted to experiment with paid ads. So we wanted to try Facebook paid ads. And so we're a climate startup, as you know, and we had the word in it, climate crisis or climate emergency, like act on it or whatever. And it was actually blocked. And we were very surprised because Facebook, we are very aware how much misinformation Facebook spreads, and also like the role of Facebook in the last US election. And climate crisis is a bad word, which is like, it's like for the US, it's a debatable term. Climate change is a debate. And that was like, that really hit me, actually. I was very surprised.
Yeah, well, that's rather surprising, really. I mean, you were kind of a victim of the algorithm there. Matthias Gallus, is that something, I mean, when the terms are defined and in a way that is maybe misguiding the whole debate?
Well, I could just flip the question a little bit and just put it from our view. It's very hard to inform properly and timely on facts when out there is basically a social media chaos going on. Mm. And well, people, they read all kinds of sources, have these debates that Mrs. Muff referred to, their private discussions and so on, and then it comes down to, okay, which source do I believe? Because there are so many sources, and in times where it's really hard to basically crunch the data, have the facts out there in a timely manner. Well, a Twitter post is always made faster than having had a look at the numbers, doing the analysis, and then posting it later. So whoever comes first kind of steers the debate that is going on out there, and that's a very big challenge, especially for the administration that is always trying to look at the facts and inform properly, but that's not necessarily always possible in a timely manner that is competitive with all the social media that is going on.
And there is no, I mean, as you know, as scientists, the peer review process, obviously it would take time, and time is the one factor that is not around on social media. Okay, so
With that, I'm sure on this topic we will have quite a few questions. Maybe this time we will have our online audience go first. Pascal? Oh, really? Okay. Yes. So let's start here in the room. Maybe a little bit of Q&A questions or comments here in St. Gallen.
Yes, Peter, and then Bea. I will be as fast as possible.
So you mentioned that before Corona, there were quite some concerns about the data security from home office and all this online work at home, work from remote places. Now, after some, let's say, almost 6 months of COVID, I mean, what is your experience let's say, in the sector? These concerns, were they right or not, or partially? I mean, were there big cases of problems or not? Did it work really everything perfectly and data security was all the time maintained or not?
Still a question, do we know?
Well, I can maybe comment two things on that. So I'm not aware of any data loss in the federal administration, or that something bad happened in the area of cybersecurity and the hack that actually happened. Coming to your question of did everything go well, went perfect? Of course not, did not. In the beginning, as everybody stayed at home, we could see that the VPN that we were using got overloaded. So you could work in the morning or in the evening hours, but during the day you would have issues, downloading some documents and sharing and so on. But it did not work perfectly from the very beginning. But then it was amazing to see how fast these issues were resolved. And people could work efficiently from home. So it took maybe, I think, 10 days or something. And then a parallel system that was already in the test phase was implemented, and you would have different VPNs that you could use, and that would decrease the times of infrastructure overload. So that went well, and also, for instance, introducing some other digital tools that were already in the testing phase. It was found that that you could work around a couple of measures by still having cybersecurity in place, because you would have different accounts and so on. And people got used to it. It's a little bit cumbersome then to use certain tools, but still it works. And people adapt, and that's a good thing.
All right. Second question, Bea.
Thank you. I want to touch upon an issue that we maybe already discussed, but I would like to elaborate a bit more. We have heard from you that in the new normal has increased the acceptance of digital tools and the usage, people are more used to it. And digitalization has been seen as a way to engage more people into the energy innovations and speed up transitions. Bottom-up approaches such as peer-to-peer solar, energy sharing platform, smart grid. Do you think it's now time to accelerate in this direction? What is missing? My question for you, Verena, as well.
Okay, maybe Verena Tiefenbeck can take that question, right?
Sure. Well, I definitely think that it's time to accelerate these things now. I mean, we have the technology available now. What's missing is actually the practical proof that this can really be scaled up, and this can also work now among a broader part of the population. I mean, I do think, again, that the current situation shows us to some extent that change is feasible and more feasible than what we might have thought before. And maybe also relating to the previous question about privacy and so on, I think a lot of projects in the past have been stalled or not even taken off because of privacy concerns. And I think privacy concerns are we should take them very serious. At the same time, at least for pilot projects, sometimes it's helpful to try out some things. guaranteeing, of course, a decent level of privacy, but not killing a project before by overburdening it with certain restrictions and requirements. So I think the Corona crisis showed us that sometimes things can be implemented, and I think we do have privacy issues still. For instance, Zoom is probably not the safest technology. Still, it's in the necessity of somehow collaborating. It has been implemented even on a very large scale. And I think now when it comes to the energy transition, I think we should simply also have the courage to try out some things in small projects where we really learn what is feasible in reality. And so moving beyond simple concepts, because I think for especially when it comes to novel concepts like peer-to-peer trading, there's a lot of conceptual studies, there's a lot of simulations and all of that. But I think what's really missing, and what we are also trying to do in our group, is to really make the step of bringing it to practice and to see how this is really working in practice, how it's accepted by people, to what extent it's overwhelming, to what extent it is feasible. And I think these are things we are missing before we can really have this kind of innovation on a large scale, to really take now those things to reality, to try them out, to also learn from, some things that don't work out maybe. And I think that requires some courage to actually carry out tests like that. But I think several of the examples out there show that it can be done. And of course, there are some issues still to be solved. But I think with every project we can learn.
Maybe these issues like privacy, data protections, have somewhat lost some of their importance given the experience with the pandemic. So you think in the future, what comes to other technologies, they are not roadblocks anymore?
I didn't understand the last two words.
They are not roadblocks anymore.
Roadblocks. Right. Let me briefly say something about privacy, and then I talk about the roadblocks. So the good thing, it's true, Zoom was criticized for privacy, but actually Team is not that much better. But Zoom was also criticized because actually it's a Chinese company. Right? So there was some political sensitivity to that. On the other hand, to bring Zoom into that big scale and the whole criticism helped to improve the application a lot. So they have built a lot of improvements into the system to make it more secure. What also happened during COVID, as I know a friend of mine has a company, that there was a security break-in the company. But I think that was less due to the digitalization in COVID, but I presume that hackers had more time, because they were also at home.
Aren't they always at home?
I don't know. I don't know really where they are. And usually, so he told me that there was a break-in, I think at 2:00 in the night. But since it's an international company, somebody actually in China detected the break-in and they could immediately react to it.
Good.
But what worries me on the security level actually is more that company have the tendency now to move more and more of their server capacity into the cloud, which is good because you would presume that the clouds are protected by experts. But also bad because you don't really know what's happened with your data anymore, because it's really out of your hands. So that would worry me much more in general. So the roadblocks, I don't think that the whole energy debate is based on technological roadblocks. I don't know. As I said, I'm not an expert, but I think it's more about the Bedenkenträger and people like that, with the discussion about how you use it and should we use it and stuff like that. I would say the technology is there and we can use it. Contradict me if you think I'm wrong, but I think it's there. It's not a technological issue.
Okay. Do we have more questions? Right here.
Thank you. So my question is about the role of social media again. What you talked about was more a bit about the bad side of social media. But I wonder also if there is not also untapped positive potential for social media within the energy transition. the fitness industry and nutrition industry is really successful in social media to connect to lifestyle and representing their products and like lifestyles connecting to that. And I wonder if we're not missing out a potential to use the power of social media to find like sustainable lifestyles that connect to renewable energies, and how to deal with that in everyday life to just like accelerate awareness within the population and show that this can also be a attractive lifestyle. So I wonder if you saw like positive examples that are successfully applying that, or if you see generally like an option for that to play a relevant role.
Okay.
I think, yeah, a quick comment, and then maybe you can add some more thoughts. Absolutely. We were focusing a little bit on the pessimistic side, but there's always, of course, a potential to use and to tap into. And I fully agree that this has not been yet utilized, connecting basically lifestyle to energy. And I think a couple of companies are trying to do that. This is a trend that we kind of see, but it's coming up right now. It's quite young, or well, some people are trying out different things right now. But energy has been for a long time basically a good, like that was hard to label. So Yellow in the beginning of the 2000s tried to do that in Germany. That went well for a couple of years, but then people are not so interested in energy. So the link is still missing, but digitalization certainly could be enabled. Could enable this kind of link in the future. We see more and more platforms like Verena Tiefenbeck has mentioned that are trying to bring together consumers that are interested in sustainable energy and sustainable products with people or prosumers, small producers with PV panels that would actually sell their energy to those people. And so this is beginning, it's coming up, but there are really different roadblocks to that. It's certainly not technology. It's a lot about regulation. So we still have no open market. So we are not able to choose any prosumer we would like to. We are bound to certain companies. We are trying to change that, but this takes a lot of time. And as you can imagine, there are many stakeholders with different interests. And also some stakeholders might potentially lose while others could win.
Would you like to add on that?
Actually, just the same observation that the good side and the bad side of social media is more or less the same. So the good side, of course, is you can easily connect to like-minded people. You can start your grassroots movement. You can easily set up a blog or something and publish with low cost what you think is right and important for the people to know. And we see organizations like that appearing as well. So yes, it's a play field, and you have to say, depending on your opinion, good and bad guys out there, but also the good guys can organize very quickly and nicely there.
Yeah, and Verena Tiefenbeck, what's your take on that? Do you see a good way on social media to, let's say, make energy awareness sexy?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've seen also with, for instance, with the Fridays for Future movement, how big, or the kind of attention that movement took, partially thanks to social movement, and all of a sudden, because it became the good thing to be part of that movement and to be engaged and so on. Maybe still a critical point on that. I think as a scientist, obviously, I often like to connect that to numbers, and I think in some of the debates, what's a bit missing is actually quantifying the real world impact of things. So I think a lot of the debates on social media are also about showing off. Yes, I'm a green-minded person, I'm a good citizen, and so on. By doing or by engaging activities that actually do not have a really big impact, like we had a huge discussion about the use of plastic straws, for instance, which I think, of course, we have a problem with plastic in the ocean, but I don't think that the focus on plastic straws in restaurants is the the game changer for sustainability. And sometimes I see that in social media even more than in normal media. There's a lot of focus on some things like that that get a lot of attention without having a huge impact. Same thing when you think about when you ask people, do you engage in pro-environmental activities? Most people, first thing that comes to their mind is, yes, I always switch off the lights, which certainly is also not the most meaningful thing you can do to actually, do your part to conserve energy. And I think I somehow wish that we managed to get more data into those debates. And I know that data often is unsexy, but I think that, to actually have these conversations on meaningful topics where people can really make a big difference. Because I think people or a large share of the population really wants to do something, wants to, cares about the environment, cares about sustainability issues. And I think we should somehow, maybe as scientists, as policymakers, as companies and so on, we should somehow try also to help to, channel this enthusiasm into the relevant topics and not into some make me feel good, but actually don't have an impact campaigns.
And so channel the data and educate people on what actually has a real effect. Maybe we would go to online. Does our online audience, are they still with us?
Of course. After some audio hiccups in the last panel, now it's running very smoothly, but they seem to be very happy with your inputs. So they seem to very much agree with your inputs. So far, no questions online. Maybe one more on site. Yes, please.
Can I hold it? What a progress. I think digitalization has a lot of potential to help consumers consume less or in a more intelligent way. But my observation is when it comes to making investments like replacing the heating system at home or whatever, at the end of the day, in particular, people in the upper half of their life, which is typically homeowners, rarely are 25 years old, and they like to have somebody to talk to in spite of everything. Digital offerings are good to get in contact, but at the end of the day, they want to talk to somebody. The city of Zurich has a specific energy consulting office, which is very successful in terms of attracting people. Now, unfortunately, Zurich, the city of Zurich, is one of the communities in the canton that has the least homeowners. Outside of the city, in the cantonal area, there is no such thing. There is the EKZ has a mandate from the canton to do consulting, and they do it very well, but they are always seen as just promoting heat pumps, which is not true, but you can't change that. So digitalization, in my opinion, should also kind of make people aware where they can get personal consulting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I can just have a quick comment on this. I absolutely agree, Gianni. That's why you probably know the program by Energy Switzerland or Energie Schweiz, Erneuerbare Heizen, so renewable heating. There's a big campaign going on with a website, and people can go to the website as basically a starting point for the process of replacing their heating system, and can inform themselves of what kind of options are out there and compare their options in different with different tools. So, for instance, they can compare the cost. They can compare the CO2 footprint of their solution they would like to buy, and then in the end they can ask for offers by people from there or by companies that are around where they live, and then they can get digitally. They can get in touch. So the first touch point with them and then they have a physical exchange and talk, and they get consulted by those experts. So that's it. We're trying to kind of push forward into this direction, having the necessary information and data broadly available for people, also to educate them what's the best solution for their heating system in a timely manner. Because for instance, when it comes to heating, it's often the case that the heating system breaks down, and that's usually in autumn time. So you don't really want to have a big consulting and big process being launched. You want to keep your house warm. So you just replace whatever is there, and that's usually gas or oil or whatever is easy. So that's one. That's one thing that is happening, and also digitalization can play a role there. Once you have the consultant online of how old is the heating system and so on, you could probably get a forecast when it's going to break down and at what point of time, or what would be the optimal point of time to replace it. So the possibilities, the technology is there, it's going to grow, but we will certainly not replace it by physical context and consulting. That's absolutely key. Exactly.
Yes, and if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's being prepared is a good thing.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes, maybe now we have some online comments as well, maybe related to this one, being able to talk to a person or who is deciding on the future solutions. The participant would like to know your opinion on whether to involve or to increase the potential of citizen councils, and not only do it via politicians and regulatory issues, but also involve the people even more in designing solutions for the future, like is done, for example, in France by President Macron. He installed such kind of citizen councils very locally to come up with solutions, sustainable solutions on site. What do you think about that?
I guess. Okay, I guess I should react to that. Well, that's the nature of Switzerland, I would say. There are so many, associations and groups, and also close by to the city and their councils. So I think that's a positive thing of enabling the public to kind of contribute to solutions and then implement them. We are from the federal office. We are supporting a program called Open Innovation, where we try to have this kind of exchange with basically a broader public on what would be a good idea for a certain community to implement and to support climate action, and then supporting them through the process of actually establishing it in their community. So this is actually happening.
Thank you very much. And one, the comment from Mr. Roberto before already generated some business for the consultants in Zurich. So the question was, what is the link to that consultancy offer in the city of Zurich? We'll post that, of course, in the chat afterwards as well. Otherwise, I think online participants are good so far.
Okay. Any more questions in the room? All right. So I thank my panelists here and online. I profoundly enjoyed this discussion, and I think this is going to stay with us for a while. This comes to a close now, and I'd like to add that even though this debate this morning is over, obviously it will be with us for years to come. So make sure to stay informed and to stay involved. I will now let Rolf Wüstenhagen leave you with some final remarks before lunch. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arthur Honecker, and dear panelists. For this, what I would like to do before we leave is to just reflect a little bit on what we've learned today and what we've discussed today. We've started out the day with kind of some general reflections on the theme we've had, which was system change, not climate change, towards a renewable normal. I think this kind of search for a new normal stayed with us all morning, and it's going to stay with us for some longer time. I didn't expect us to kind of already know exactly where we're going, But I think we've had some really interesting reflections along the day. We started off with Charlie Wilson, joining us from his Cornwall breakfast table in the UK, and talking to us about how to get to 1.5 degrees without a magic bullet. He started out reminding us that many of the mainstream climate scenarios seem to rely on something that he calls a magic bullet, which is, for example, carbon capture and storage, a technology that does not really exist on a commercial scale. And of course, if you put all your eggs into a basket of something that doesn't exist, you're at risk. So what he did instead was kind of come up with scenarios of how we could get towards a climate-safe world without a magic bullet. And he pointed out that granular technology is an important idea. So distributed, decentralized, smaller scale technologies, which have two advantages. They deploy faster and they improve more quickly. So that was an interesting input into the debate. We then kind of talked about, in the first panel, about the role of business in making that transition happen. One of these granular technologies, obviously, is solar photovoltaics. We've had Cornelia Daniel joining us from Vienna in Austria, sharing some of the experience that she and her solar business have had in recent months. It seemed that they actually rather benefited during the crisis. There was this interesting new market segment of people afraid of blackouts, a bit like it reminded me of year 2000 when we all thought the world would end on the 31st of December 1999. So that's a new kind of driver. Hopefully this is not going to be a long-term thing. What she said, what's important is that while many people like solar, there's no immediate need for it. And creating that kind of sense of urgency where people then would take the step and not just say, okay, at some point I want to put solar panels on my roof, but actually do it now, that is something where she felt there's a gap that potentially governments could close. Other elements of that discussion were André Reichel's point of view that even Germans can improvise. And we then had a discussion that that's true for Swiss as well, which is something that the crisis has taught us, which we maybe weren't so aware of before. And then we also heard how the climate movement was going to react to it. We had an interesting announcement about a week of civil disobedience, and we were curious to hear what this is going to mean. We were reassured that there's going to be no violence involved, but we'll all watch out for what's going to happen in Bern in the last week of September. And along the way, we also learned that if you want to meet Jochen Wermuth again on the 25th of September, you'll find him nearby Luisa Neubauer and Greta Thunberg, and lots of employees from Axel Springer. What a mix, what an interesting mix in Berlin at the Global Climate Strike. We ended that discussion with some recommendations from Austria about this great Austrian politician called Arnold Schwarzenegger, who has some experience in framing policies around, for example, the Clean Air Act and not the Climate Crisis Act or something of that sort. So kind of having that kind of spin towards solutions in mind is certainly something that we need if we want to solve the climate crisis. We then had a second panel which looked into finance, climate finance. It's the nature of days in this time of the year in St. Gallen that you start the day with a bit of fog, and then, as it is the case now, you have the sun coming up. I wasn't quite sure sometimes during that panel whether we're still in the foggy part of the day already in the sunny part. I think that's inherent in kind of some of the discussions around the financial sector. We've had kind of some views from panelists here that sounded like there's already a lot happening, that Switzerland seems to be one step ahead of other countries. We heard things about a taxonomy that is going to be even better in with a Swiss finish than in the version that the European Union has come up with. We talked about, is that going to be a green, a light green, a brown green? What kind of taxonomy is that going to be? We also heard that the Bank of England is apparently widely appreciated for its thought leadership around climate risk. It wasn't immediately clear whether that would mean that any kind of similar Swiss institution like the Swiss National Bank would take a similar role, or whether in these international debates the Swiss financial sector is looking for some different way of differentiating itself. Also, we talked about one particular thing that the Bank of England has done, which was to stress test its banks against climate risk, which was it seemed to me, also appreciated. We heard from at least one of the banks that they would be open to this idea. And it seems like that could be one way of kind of bringing together this climate issue with the kind of language that bankers speak, and also with the kind of financial risks that they actually maybe care even more about than some of the environmental aspects that are important to many of us. We also then kind of ended that panel with Katrin Werli kind of saying that customer demand would actually help a lot. So all of you are probably customers of a bank. So listen to that call, go to your bank tomorrow and ask for some investment opportunities in low carbon technologies. I think that would help and would make their life easier. Finally, we came to the last panel here on digitalization. Again, very interesting to reflect on the experience we've all gone through in the recent months with this accelerated digitalization that has happened in so many areas of life, work life in particular. We heard the different experiences that the panelists had, like Fabian Muff saying that she had actually kind of efficiency gains. Same with Sigrid Hanschuh, who was happy to be able to move around from one meeting to another without even going through downtown St. Gallen. As a resident of the city of St. Gallen, I was a little bit concerned what that would imply for the brick and mortar stores that make some of the quality of life of the city. But yes, we have seen this discrepancy with some companies benefiting, technology companies like Amazon and Zoom are benefiting a lot, some others having more trouble, and that's a space to watch. One thing that I also found interesting and important in this final panel was Verena Tiefenbeck's call for learning by doing. So that it's not just a matter of kind of coming up with concepts and studies, but that some of the things can actually only be solved if we do stuff and learn from mistakes and then kind of keep improving things, which I think created a nice link back to the initial discussion about we shouldn't wait for a magic bullet. We need to actually take steps, maybe make some mistakes, but then learn from them. So quite a broad spectrum of topics we've discussed. I ended my introduction presentation this morning with the question, where do we go from here? So here we are, asking that same question. I can't tell you exactly where the world is going. I can tell you more precisely where we as a group are going from here. For those of you who participate here in the room, we go for lunch. So like in the good old days, we will have lunch together. Lunch will be served one floor up, or you can, now that the sun is coming out here in St. Gallen, you can also take your lunch outside. One other thing, talking about learning by doing, this was the first time that we had this blended format for our conference. We were on the learning curve, as you could tell from some of the technology aspects. To be able to learn, we need feedback. So any feedback you would have on this event, both for people in the room, but also for our online participants, would be much appreciated. We'll be in touch with a link to a feedback form next week, and we would very much like to hear from you. Furthermore, in previous editions of this conference, we had workshops in the afternoon. Today you have a free afternoon and kind of can reflect on all of this. However, we would love to see you back for the webinars that we're doing on Fridays. You can see on Fridays, we care about the future. We do that from starting in 2 weeks' time on the 25th of September, and you're invited to join these webinars, which will take place on Zoom. And you would have to go back to our website, REMforum.ch, to register for each of the webinars that you would like to attend. And then you will get the link similar to those who have participated online today and have already gone through that process. With that, I think we're at the end of this inspiring morning session. I want to thank once again our speakers, our panelists who joined us both here and remotely. It was an interesting set of speakers, of experts from different parts of this energy market and related sectors. I also want to thank very much our moderator, Arthur Honecker, for guiding us through these different panels. And I would also like to thank my team. This kind of making this event happen was more of a challenge this year than it was in previous years, as you can imagine. So I'm particularly thankful to the people who made it possible. From both kind of the organizational point of view, but also the content point of view. So Doris Hövel, our program, our manager, conference manager, then Nina Schneider, who was taking care of the program, Beatrice Petrovic, who did the moderation yesterday, and then also Natalie Dellenbach, Jana Plananska, Alex Stauch, and Pascal Richard, who were kind of taking care of the technical issues here on site. Adrian Rinscheid, who also helped Merla, who prepared her presentation. So you see, it was a big team that was involved. Also Elizabeth Cotte, who programmed the coffee breaks for the virtual coffee breaks. So lots of things to be thought of. Given that, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I hope you enjoyed the experience here. Look forward to catching up with some of you over lunch. Also, farewell to the groups of our executive education program who finalized their module, and we hopefully will see each other in person for the next module in Berlin in January. And then for all of us, please do stay in touch. And thank you very much for coming. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you.